This video is sponsored by FlexiSpot. If you've been following along on Twitter, you'll know that me, my girlfriend, and our budgies recently entered the adult world and bought a place together. New digs meant a new office, and especially a new desk, and FlexiSpot's standing desk is pushing my workspace in the right direction. This isn't me, by the way, it's a FlexiSpot ad. This guy has a better PC than me. This is me, or at least my setup. That's my tiny second monitor, that's my laggy laptop. It's a work in progress, I haven't soundproofed the space yet, but yeah, it's getting there. The desk is the best part though. I'm not even being paid to say that, it legitimately is. You've probably heard that sitting is the new smoking when it comes to working from home, and I know I'm not the only one who started to feel the strain on his back. Standing desks are the solution, but with a lot of standing desks, you're either stuck with it or manually need to adjust its size every time. With FlexiSpot, it couldn't be easier. You plug it in, push the button, and boom, you're now sitting. Boom, you're now standing. Boom, you're somewhere in the middle because it's fully configurable to meet whichever size you need it to. I've got it in standing mode right now because I like to stand when I'm recording audio for these videos. Sitting's overrated. Chairs are for nerds. Thanks again to FlexiSpot, links in the description, and on with the video.
I don't know if you're familiar with New Weird, but it's as a literary genre, it borrows aspects from science fiction and horror, and takes those things and twists them into something new and exciting and fresh.
This is dumb. I know, that's a curt way to open this video, but there are few things in this floating, watery rock we call home which are as pretentious as the creation of new unnecessary subgenres. Speculative fiction, mundane science fiction, slipstream fiction, the ability for certain academics to pigeonhole fantastical stories into meaningless boxes has always been a pet peeve of mine. Regularly, all it means is that your story and world is like this well-known genre, but ooh, it's a little bit different. Take slipstream fiction. Coined by Richard Dorset in 1989, its definition is a genre which focuses on the fiction of strangeness, or a form of writing that makes the familiar strange or the strange familiar. In other words, Dorset has repurposed one subgenre, magical realism, and renamed it. He used it to describe science fiction stories which weren't in the mainstream, they were in the slipstream. Cowabunga. Yeah, the next time you hear a crusty old timer criticize Zoomers for inventing irreverent words, remind them that their generation invented the term slipstream, a dumb phrase that just describes science fiction which pushes boundaries into other genres. In other words, good science fiction. But none of these arbitrary subgenres bother me as much as new, weird fiction. Not to be confused with weird fiction, which already existed. What's the difference between new weird and weird, you ask? Bugger all. It's a notorious blending of science fiction, horror, and fantasy which is, ooh, a little bit different. In short, it's fiction which pushes and crosses genre boundaries. And as we all know, this is something which had never happened prior to 1989. What do you mean I'm lying? The first romantic comedy came out in 1998, you idiot. Science fiction and fantasy in one story? What a weird idea! New weird is a dumb phrase and a dumb way to describe Control. Control is a good science fiction game in a great science fiction world, capitalizing on Alan Wake's thrilling fantasy to envelope it in this beautiful, consistent tone that's just so cool with a capital K. And I will be referencing Alan Wake a few times in this analysis, so I've linked my critique of it below in case you missed it. That game built off its inspirations of Twin Peaks and Stephen King in a meta sense. Thematically, Wake's story was all about inspiration, about writer's block, so wearing the David Lynchisms on its sleeve gave it a really robust flavour. And as much as I love that game, Control is braver in a lot of ways. Creative director Sam Lake took what he learned from Alan Wake and Quantum Break and bounced into a new tone, style, and atmosphere which felt uniquely him. And whilst Control also embraces its inspirations, namely the SCP Foundation and elements of Twin Peaks Season 3, there's a lot more remedy in here than there was in Max Payne or Alan Wake. If Alan Wake went beyond inspiration, Control arguably goes even further. Particularly with its setting, it captures so much more imagination, so much more potential in one concrete skyscraper than the entirety of, say, Watch Dogs Legion's London, despite the difference in size. There's character and intrigue in every desk, every whiteboard, every light fitting. There's a clear love and care that's been put into how we breathe the oldest house's shifting shape and size. Superfans of the game are able to overlook its obvious flaws because of how unique and awe-inspiring the oldest house is in both atmosphere and world design. And for this reason alone, I'd heartily recommend it to anyone and everyone who'll listen to me. Control is a captivating, stylish and invigorating game in a lot of ways, with an aesthetic and philosophy which shows off Remedy at its very best. But new weird, if we're taking that term seriously, it is not. Because for all of the great that's in here, and there really is a lot of great, the game, at least for me, avoids being called a masterpiece because it doesn't fully embrace its weirdness in a mechanical sense. At points, it sludges through some really trite and really dull modern game design, which holds it back from being a truly unique experience. For a lot of people, I know this was their 2019 Game of the Year, and while it's not mine, I do think it's well worth that title. It's a game of peaks and valleys. When it does well, it does incredibly well, but when it's naff, it's really naff. There's a lot of freshness in here, like a day-old pear in a fruit bowl, but it's sat alongside apples and oranges, which are beginning to go soft. And we're going to cover all of it, gobble up the pears and the oranges, the good and the bad, to see if we can answer one question. Is Control just interesting because of the FBC and the oldest house? Or is there more to it? Does it go beyond the weird? This is a commentary and critique of Control and its DLC. SCP-4885 is an anomalous humanoid resembling the main character of the popular series of puzzle books, Where's Wally, known in the US as Where's Waldo. In the event that a subject knows of SCP-4885's current location at any given time, it will move to the nearest wall and begin to phase into it. SCP-4885 will appear inside of the subject and will reach up the esophagus and grab the subject's chin through their mouth. If a subject discovers SCP-4885's location, the entity will instead approach the subject, attempt to climb into the subject's mouth, enter their abdomen, and exit their body through the subject's pelvis. During this time, SCP-4885 can easily dislocate, relocate any joint in its body, and its skin and muscles will gain the consistency of a malleable solid, allowing it to easily climb into and out of the subject. SCP-4885 creates uncharacteristic corpses, known as SCP-4885-1. The entire body of an SCP-4885-1 is covered in illustrations similar to those found in Where's Wally books, with many different characters appearing on its skin. These illustrations originate from the liquid that exits the corpse's mouth. Currently, no instances of the cartoon character Wally have been found on SCP-4885-1. These illustrations appear to fuse to its skin and cannot be removed from the subject unless the skin it is placed on is also removed.
They're lying to us. We're lying to ourselves. The room's not the world. The world is much bigger and much stranger.
There's an easy parallel to draw between Control's opening seconds and Alan Wake's closing ones. Jesse-Faden speaks to a supernatural entity, Polaris, just as Alan spoke aloud to the dark presence, but both are truly addressing the player. She describes a room with a poster where you stare transfixed, hypnotized by it so we ignore the oddities crawling out from the hole it covers. It's much like that ocean Alan described at the end of his story, hinting that there's more strangeness further out to sea. That it's not confined to Cauldron Lake, that our understanding so far of the Remedy-verse has barely touched the surface of what they have in store for us. This is apt because Control adopts a lot of oceanic imagery as we wade through the FBC's bizarre hallways. The Ocean View Motel is a gateway between other planes of reality. Everyone's favourite janitor, Ahti, gets his name from Finnish mythology, resembling a god of the sea. It's a testament to how seriously Sam Lake and Mikhail Kasurinin are taking the establishment of their own little gameverse that even when Control started to lose me, the convoluted and open-ended nature of some of its mysteries always felt purposeful. This is something I'll make a stronger case for later in the video, but Control does feel meticulous in its world building, its detail, and how it forces us to play. It's never just enough to open a game by telling a player that your game world is scary, or mysterious, or even interesting. Extra Credits has gone on the record as saying that a great first 5 minutes naturally elevates the impression a game leaves on the player in the long run. A bad game with a great opening is likely to make you give it the benefit of the doubt when it stumbles and falls later, but a great game, which takes 10 hours to become great, makes the inconsistencies more obvious. It's just how human nature works. Anyone who's watched my Nubis Humanus videos or the first 10 Minutes series knows that I am fascinated by game openings, and I give games a little longer than 5 minutes. As my series suggests, I think modern games deserve 10, despite the oversaturation of experiences at our fingertips, making it less and less likely that we'll stick with something if it doesn't hook us immediately. By the 10-minute mark of Control, the player is left with one clear impression: that this opening is very, very The first 30 seconds throw haphazard and nonsensical images at us with bold, stimulating colours to keep it all united, to keep it feeling purposeful. Even if Jesse's opening monologue is a little gratuitous in its metaphor, it builds upon the density of its atmosphere, and I do mean that literally. The Oldest House's introduction is heavy, like a brooding heat. There's a thick, droning hum undercutting its opening cinematic. The game's brutalist aesthetic is understated, but the player is still very aware of it by the time Jesse's legs become our left stick. Her eyeline is immediately drawn to a dark, boorish desk, strangely abandoned despite the busyness of the outside world. The huge, authoritative FBC logo beneath our feet, despite the fact something bad happened here, the Oldest House's first impression is orderly, not chaotic. The most out-of-place thing in the environment are the scattered sheets of paper on the upper floor. The nearby corridors are shrouded in darkness, simply lit by pillars of stubborn light from the discarded offices. The bits of lore we find are standard, uninteresting. No letters warning us to stay away, nothing even close to a personal file, just a couple of security orders and manifests. It feels immovable. And then we meet Ahti, and everything changes.
Very good. I'm Ahti, the janitor, by the way. You'll work for me. You can say I sent you.
Ahti is the most powerful human figure in the game, if he even is human. He acknowledges that we're clearly here for the job of his assistant, apt considering he seems to be the keeper of the Oldest House, putting the director one rung below him on the hierarchy. He's an odd guy, our first true sign that there's something else happening here, but Control waits until the 6-minute mark to play its strongest hand. He ushers you further down the corridor, granting you passage to the Oldest House, giving his approval for you to go past the poster, and with this blessing, you get the only time Control lets us experience one of these shifts which we hear about later on. The Oldest House is bigger on the inside and can change at will, but due to technical limitations, we only get to experience these shifts outside of scripted moments once, here, which is disappointing, but hot damn if it's not an effective introduction. Somehow, Jesse has returned to the FBC entrance hallway despite the geography of the opening not adding up. It doesn't make sense. Suddenly there's an elevator here which wasn't there before. The doorway you walk through has now moved. The game does all of this without announcement. No cutscenes. In fact, I was paying so much attention to the portraits on the wall that I didn't even realise it on my first playthrough. I just felt that something had changed. All of this is here to add to that bubbling strangeness which has started to spill over with each passing second. It's a shame then that Jesse's reaction undermines a lot of this intrigue. She either doesn't notice this shift or doesn't particularly care. Noting Ahti's behaviour, she waves it away as
"Janitor's gonna Johnny,"
and us as players are likely to find this jarring. About 2/3 into the game, Jesse delves deeper and deeper into the Oldest House, frantically searching for a cheeky plastic flamingo which can control the weather. As she touches it, it teleports her to an eerie, violet, glowing, kaleidoscopic tunnel, needing to levitate so that the warping walls don't reset her. Reaching the end, she cleanses the flamingo, ripping its powers from it, and accidentally unleashes a gargantuan creature with a massive spotlight for an eye which she needs to battle. When all of this is over and she catches her breath, she licks her lips and mutters,
I never did like flamingos. Too pink.
It's one of many moments in Control where you'll be reminded of how bland Jessie is as a character, how confusing her reactions are to the insane events she witnesses, how counterintuitive her motivations are as her story progresses. The player has just been rollicked along on a paranormal rollercoaster, and Jessie doesn't gasp, doesn't question, doesn't even blink in the face of the corruption she witnesses. With every passing moment of Control's 15 to 30 hours, depending on how much of the oldest house you want to explore, you feel more and more disassociated with Jessie. Her history is fascinating, her positioning as a protagonist is intriguing, but more often than not, you'll feel a similar relationship to Jesse Faden as she does to the mysterious board. Two beings reluctantly aligned in their overarching goal, despite being at odds for much of the journey.
And this gun's alive. You know what? I'm happy. Happy to be here.
Reaching our 10th minute, this is one of a handful of moments where Jessie's characterization counteracts what I just said. She's more than mildly perturbed by Director Trench's suicide. She's in shock and awe at the board's message and finding herself on the astral plane, and most interestingly of all, she seems to be excited by this. And excited is fine. It's great, in fact. I, as a player, am excited by this because of how palpable the game's opening has been. There are so many strands to unweave. So much is happening. It's almost overwhelming. What an interesting direction to take our character. It makes sense that she would be excited after everything she went through. She spent her entire life looking for proof that she's not crazy, that Polaris is real, and that her world isn't a lake. It is, in fact, an ocean. But this doesn't last long. Soon after binding with the service weapon, Jessie stops being amazed by the world and instead embraces the FBC's mundanity in her treatment of the game world. I mentioned in my Alan Wake critique how pivotal Barry Wheeler is to that game's entertainment factor. He's a snarky, disbelieving fanny who doesn't believe in the game's magical elements until a hurricane of shadowbirds makes him keek his pants. This acclimates the player to the bizarreness through Barry's eyes. I said then that I wanted more Barry Wheeler in all of Remedy's games, and instead Control gives you no Barry Wheeler and a full embrace of the odd stuff. And that's fine. Magical realism, another dumb subgenre I've mentioned before, regularly has a main character who just accepts the weird stuff with barely an eyebrow raised. But this always, without exception, causes a rift between a reader, viewer, player, and a protagonist. Interestingly, Jesse's behaviour was a conscientious choice on the part of Sam Lake. In The Art and Making of Control, he states, "I understand that she should be more freaked out. In Quantum Break, we wanted Jack Joyce to feel like an everyman, so when you get a gun and shoot the first enemy, it should be a hard shock to him and he would need to overcome that. But Control is more action-packed, and the truth is that in an action game, there's no room for that shock and no time for getting over it. You only need to look at pretty much any interview with Lake in the run-up to the game's release to see that Control is clearly a response to the feedback Remedy got with Quantum Break. But here, I think he learned the wrong lesson. The fact that Jessie isn't upset about shooting Hiss isn't the issue. It's the fact that she absorbs a floppy disk which gives her telekinesis with all the ecstasy of an aspirin.
Okay, Jessie. I'm Emily. Look, somehow, this hostile force, this
Hiss?
That works. Somehow the Hiss managed to infiltrate the building without any warning.
And just like that, my name for it is official.
Emily Pope, marry me. Emily is as close to Barry Wheeler as Control gets. She's not an idiot like my favourite agent, in fact she's a downright genius, and once Jessie rescues her from some Hiss, she acts as our go-to if the player has any questions about the FBC or the entities they were studying. She doesn't know everything, in fact she's learning a lot alongside us, which is what makes her gold dust to the game's immersion. Remedy's famously gorgeous attention to detail is reflected in Pope's characterization. She's full of nervous energy, endlessly curious, presented to us whenever Jessie asks her a question. She often speaks looking off to the side, or up at the ceiling, or down at the ground, only occasionally making very intense eye contact. Oof, Emily, I'll tell you all my secrets. It's a similar neat detail to what we saw with Paul Randolph's limp in Alan Wake. Remedy often give its characters relevant little gimmicks which relate their physicality to their personalities. Trench is always still in his scenes, reinforcing his obstinance. Arish fidgets with his hands when speaking to Jessie, but is calm and collected with his subordinates. All of this is wonderful, and it's what keeps Remedy's worlds, even the weird ones, feeling fully realised. But to take it back to Jesse, Emily Pope also represents the moment where I started to feel at odds with director Faden. At a later moment, there's some optional dialogue with Emily where she begins to discuss important, crucial details she's learned about the Hiss, the strange creatures we fight while navigating the oldest house. Emily mentions that she may have figured out what the Hiss are trying to say, what they might be telling us, but Jesse cuts her off, nipping that she just wants to find out where her brother Dylan is. But if you're anything like me, you will care about what Emily has to say. What has she learned about the Hiss? What does she know? There's a clash between the player's motivation unearthing the oldest house's secrets and Jesse's motivation. She couldn't care less about the FBC's experiments unless it leads to her brother. The weird just isn't weird to Jesse after the first 10 minutes, and that is Control's first mistake. The second is in her character design. What is the first physical thing you think of when you imagine Jesse Faden? It's her hair, right? If you colour her hair anything but this stark red, her aesthetic fades into the background. This, her everyday leather jacket and jeans, separates her from the clinical office wear and hazmat suits of the FBC's employees, but I don't think it goes far enough. If Jesse is supposed to initially represent this cataclysmic force to the FBC's dogma, I'd argue her character design doesn't fully realise it. That art book I referenced previously showcases over 100 iterations of her look, from a shaven head to cornrows to green hair. A scarf keeps returning again and again, and at one point she looked a little like Judy from Cyberpunk 2077. Remedy initially embraced this punkier style to Jesse, but, well, I might as well let lead character artist Auntie Pomio speak for herself. It became much more about hiding in plain sight, she said. Constantly searching for the bureau, working odd jobs and stuff like that. She had to fit into society at least a little bit to make a living. And whilst I'm all for character design being informed by a character's personality, I'd much rather have a roguish, chaotic style to Jesse, which truly contrasted the FBC's emphasis on order. She comes here intending to break the bureau down, grab her brother and get out again, but this initial presentation with the black shades and one shock of colour doesn't endear me to that plan. It's a minor nitpick, I know, but it highlights how Remedy overthought some of Control's most basic ideas, and we'll see this return again and again. As a character, Jesse's an analytical nightmare because there's plenty of evidence to suggest that she's just an unfortunate charisma vacuum. I think it's no accident that out of the 20 developers and artists interviewed for the art and making of Control, not a single one listed her as their favourite character. Christ, Mikhail Kasurin, the game's creative director, listed Langston over Jesse. Langston, the Catman that locks himself in a security bunker. Come on, pal, nobody's favourite is Langston. But I don't think labeling Jesse Faden as boring is the end of it. I think she suffers because the FBC is the main character of Control, not Jesse. For a lot of players, it's just so cool that she pales in comparison to it. Which brings me on to... SCP-XXXX is a large retail unit previously owned by and branded as IKEA, a popular furniture retail chain. A person entering SCP-3008 through the main entrance will find themselves translocated to SCP-3008-1. This displacement will typically go unnoticed as no change will occur from the perspective of the victim. They will generally not become aware until they try to return to the entrance. SCP-3008-1 is a space resembling the inside of an IKEA furniture store, extending far beyond the limits of what could physically be contained within the dimensions of the retail unit. Current measurements indicate an area of at least 10 kilometers squared, with no visible external terminators detected in any direction. Inconclusive results from the use of laser rangefinders has led to the speculation that the space may be infinite. SCP-3008-2 are humanoid entities that exist within SCP-3008-1. While superficially resembling humans, they possess exaggerated and inconsistent bodily proportions, often described as being too short or too tall. They possess no facial features, and in all observed cases wear a yellow shirt and blue trousers, consistent with the IKEA employee uniform.
Part 2. Secure, Contain, Protect.
I said I was looking for answers, but I might never understand them. I'm not looking for proof. This is already it. More than enough. No matter what they told me all those years, I know it's real now.
Control's storytelling is a lovely fusion of Remedy's mastery of in-game lore and the homegrown conspiracies of the SCP Foundation. You likely already know what the SCP is if you found this video, thanks for being here by the way, consider subscribing, but if you're arching an eyebrow or frantically googling the term, let me explain so we're all on the same page. The SCP Foundation dates back to 2008, when the internet was just leaving for college. It stands for Secure, Contain, Protect. It's an organisation documented by the web-based collaborative fiction project of the same name. Within the website setting, the SCP is responsible for locating and containing individuals, entities, locations, and objects that violate natural law. It's entirely fictional, or is it? But it's also one of the coolest things on the internet. That a group of people who don't know each other abide by set rules and restraints to create an interconnected universe together. That is badass. A lot of the files you can find take the format of professional documentation with names and locations redacted here and there. If you ever liked rummaging through Dark Souls lore to piece together what the hell's up with Knight Artorias, you would love poring over the SPC's files and case studies. It's no secret that Remedy pulled from the SCP when crafting the Federal Bureau of Control. The bureaucracy which colours its offices is pulled straight from the sort of institution which would redact the location of a friggin' IKEA store. But Remedy doesn't just rip off the SCP Foundation, it takes a few steps further in establishing a wide array of tones. Control is funny, terrifying, human, inhuman in its portrayal of the FBC. Some of the notes you find are hilarious. The story of a mailman furious that the mail tubes get spat into other dimensions. A no smoking rule needing to be enforced in the quarry because it looks and feels like it's outside, but it's still technically inside a government building. A sticky note which keeps copying itself overtakes an employee's office, so he files a complaint and demands he works from home until it's remedied. The objects of power have OOPS as their acronyms, for God's sake. Control's humour is almost sentient, it's so self-aware of how ridiculous the FBC's existence is. These are broken up with clinical analysis of the game's enemies, dissecting them and providing their weaknesses in the form of research papers. Some of the papers you can find are so heavily redacted that it's hard to make sense of what they're even talking about. Their form and the way they're written teaching us more about the FBC than what's actually on the page. The Threshold kids are harrowing, not just because Mr. Bones always seems to be on the verge of cutting Meg's face off and wearing it, it's also because of the live action footage used and the ominous pauses. Control does this a few times. Dr. Darling's big, optimistic face dominates a lot of your screen time in FMV. We never see one of Control's most important characters in-game, but the unnaturalness of his existence, being played by Alan Wake actor and my future best friend, Matthew Peretta, makes him feel ethereal. Which is apt, because by the end of the game, that's pretty much where Darling is, the ether. Another way Control uses its FMV is with the hotline.
A director needs a team. My management team. These people know the secrets of the Bureau as well as I do.
So on the advice of Emily Pope, Jessie has reached her second object of power, the hotline, contained in a plastic box towering over an abyssal drop. Comparisons to Magneto's cell in X-Men 2 are completely fair, as this was, in fact, its inspiration. This is Jessie's link to the ominous board and those who have passed on while in service to them. She can hear ghostly whisperings of Director Trench, which are illuminated with this ominous navy light projected in front of her. The most effective thing about these is that when they appear in the game world, they're broken, throwing out keywords to grab our attention, but not telling us the full story unless we want it. So much pivotal information is contained in the hotline. Trench's background, information about some of the OOPs, the wants and desires of the board are hidden in these messages, and this information is truly optional after the first time you experience it. If you're not interested in the FBC's secrets, you can just leave that part of your menu blank and charge into the next bombastic set piece. This philosophy continues through the entirety of Control. An easy 75% of the story is missing from the main campaign, and as a result, it can feel really satisfying when you start to put the puzzle together through your own efforts. Nothing is spoon-fed to you, everything is in the details. In fact, the stuff which is handed to you on a silver platter often just leads to more questions, which you can answer by hunting for information deeper into the oldest house. After finding the hotline, Jesse is sent down to maintenance to unlock the rest of the FBC. Down here is a carousel horse which can give Jesse the ability to evade and dodge. The walls warp and spin, and it's one of the craziest rooms in the game. Finding information on its containment procedure tells us a lot about what the FBC did with the damn thing once they obtained it, but there's no information as to how the hell they even found it in the first place. Until you explore further and hear an old radio show where one of the callers ring in describing crazy things happening at his local amusement park. You could go the whole game without knowing any of this. Now, I realise that there's a discourse happening in games right now with regards to hiding important plot points in optional lore, but I think Control sidesteps the arguments both for and against by making the optional nature of its discoveries one thing: necessary. Control has so much information that at times it feels like it's starting to leak. The nature of the FBC is so cryptic at first that you've barely gotten a handle on what its purpose is before the board suddenly appears to make things weirder, and then the nature of the hiss starts to throw things off balance, and oh, it turns out there's a goddamn evil mold in the basement which predates this game's big bad, and where the hell did Darling go anyway? If everything Control should tell you was in the main story or the cutscenes, I think even its most fascinating parts would get uninteresting really quickly purely due to exposition dumps and sensory overload, but by tossing its tail into the air and asking the player to scramble around to pick it back up again, it incentivizes exploration. But it's not all peaches and cream, or apples and pears. I forget the food analogy. Look, Control's lore pickups aren't perfect. I haven't been so frustrated by tape recordings in a long time. Needing to stand near a radio in Alan Wake to hear Pat Maine's nightly broadcasts were cutesy because there were only a handful of them, and it kept the player vulnerable in one position for a long period of time, adding to its tension. There are almost 100 broadcasts and interviews in Control, and if you walk more than 3 feet away from a tape recorder while they're playing, they fade away. The FBC justifies its musty old worldliness in the fact that new technology doesn't work in the oldest house, but Remedy, you created this world. You decide what technology works and what doesn't. There's no reason Jesse couldn't use an old cassette player so we could listen to these audio files on the move. You want to hear about the FBC's discoveries and rules while you explore, but finding a tape recorder halts you in your tracks, and that's counterintuitive.
Can you help me get to the override?
Yes, easy peasy. It's just around the corner. But first, we need to get you working. Very small couple of hours job.
Even the structuring of the story is clinical. Almost every cutscene is either an ambient panning shot of locations, or two characters standing opposite each other and talking. When you recall what happens in Alan Wake, scenes like the Clicker meeting Mr. Scratch in the darkness, Dr. Hartman being eaten by the dark presence, these are the moments you remember with curated camera angles and music cues. Control is all about the standy talky bits. For a game which is so intent on operating in style and substance, chatting to any of the FBC employees sacrifices the former for the latter. I was so desperate for a character to move in any of these scenes, but Jessie and her counterpart, even the elusive Ati, are so stilted in their animations. The game tries its best with the varied camera angles, but hot damn, if Control 2 comes out and I need to watch the camera cut to Jessie's eye while she says something like,
Funny thing is, I've been a janitor.
I'm going to swim to Finland and paint it on their flag. Just kidding, Mr. Lake, I am a huge fan, honest. It makes you miss those excellent cutscenes Remedy have been so famous for in the past. It's the same dialogue, camera angle we've seen in Mass Effect, Fallout 4, Assassin's Creed, Watch Dogs, Legion. Hell, at least in Mass Effect you could occasionally punch someone so someone moved their bodies. It's not a major problem at first, but by 2/3 in, it takes some of the bite out of wanting to chat to any of the FBC's NPCs, making you want to get out of there ASAP. However, you could argue that this is the point. Hell, I hope that it is. Control's cutscenes are purposefully minimal because the moment-to-moment gameplay is the star of the show. I challenge anyone to tell me when or how it's revealed to us what the HRAs do without replaying the game, but if I mention the word fridge,
Look, someone has to watch this object at all times, or it deviates.
Or quarry, or even the maze to you, 3 easily distinguishable gameplay moments are what come to mind. Control truly embraces Ludo narration, storytelling through gameplay, through exploration, and I would argue that maybe part of Control's success is that there's no interesting or distracting cutscenes to take away from the gameplay, meaning the big player moments stand out even more. I just wish I got to see what it would be like if Remedy tried to have their cake and eat it too, because there's an absence of directorial control during the big important narrative moments, like Jesse and Dylan reuniting, which I think would have added some emotional weight. Atty represents Control's greatest mishandling of its SCP inspirations. Aside from a small handful of really good side quests, which we'll get to, it sometimes feels like the zaniness of the oops are subdued by dull objectives. He referred to us as the janitor's assistant at the start of the game, and after 15 minutes of running around maintenance, you start to feel like it. He points you to a corkboard with tasks to undertake, things he's leaving to you because he's about to go on vacation. Your first task is to go and deal with a huge, fire-breathing furnace, which a document and a tape recording seem to hint is alive. What a cool idea. I wonder what we'll have to do when we get there. Oh, we're just throwing 6 barrels at it? Not quite the new weird I was expecting. Oh, and it accidentally bounced off a wall, so now I don't know where it is. Control promises so much with its SCP comparisons, but in practice, its ideas and presentation are greater than what you're asked to do by the mission log. On your first visit, maintenance is the least interesting level of the game. The grimy mechanical flooring, cogs and wheels churning, long tunnels clogged with literal piles of shit. It's visually displeasing, but not in a way which is memorable, and unfortunately, your time down here begins to feel like busy work. Find Atty, find Irish, fix the coolant pumps, fix the energy converters, initiate the director override. On the whole, Control's plot is one big excuse to go on a tour of the oldest house, experiencing some of its greatest hits along the way and unraveling its smaller mysteries, so when you're rewarded with something different, something that sticks with you as a result of that busy work, it makes it all worth it. But in maintenance, there's not much to see outside of standard video game staples, and by the end of the game, it's the section which sticks out most as wasting the player's time. So, shall we talk about combat then? SCP-127, upon first glance, appears to be a standard MP5K submachine gun. Tests have revealed that aside from the outer steel shell, the entirety of the firearm is organic and alive. The weapon's ammunition initially appears to be human-like teeth. However, DNA testing of the bullets resulted in no match to any known species on Earth. SCP-127 features 2 settings, semi-automatic and fully automatic. An audible groan can be heard when switching between the two. Upon depleting the weapon's magazine, it takes between 3 to 5 days to regrow a new supply of ammunition. Attempts to remove the magazine have resulted in failure. It seems to be permanently attached to the weapon. SCP-127 was originally located in the house of Mr. James. Mr. was found dead from a heart attack on the night of November 17th, 1991. No complications or unusual circumstances were found to lead to his death. Due to his extensive gun collection, the ATF and the FBI were notified to collect his weapons. SCP-127 was discovered during testing and cataloguing and was promptly collected by SCP agents.
Part 3. Jesse Smash.
Marshall is the next step. What Emily told me about Odd-inary, my powers being connected to things in the Bureau's past, I am so close to something.
Jessie has ingratiated herself with the FBC for just a few hours, but in that time, she begins to warm up to best girl Emily Pope. She reluctantly explains why she came to the FBC. She's looking for her brother. The Bureau took him because they activated an OOP back in their hometown of Odd-inary, a slide projector. What's really interesting here is how unaware Pope is of Jessie's past. The FBC, specifically Darling and Trench, has buried the slide projector, barely trusting anyone to conduct research on it. The fact that our blonde fountain of knowledge doesn't know where the projector is makes it immediately tantalizing. You could even say it's enthralling. God forbid we use fun adjectives to describe games. Me no like 11-letter words. Control does this often, revealing layers and layers of secrets, showcasing just how bureaucratic and inept the Bureau became under Trench's control. At this point in the game, Pope is the closest we have to an authority figure, but even she only seems to know about 10% of what's going on. With Pope's help, Jesse drops to the research sector, and for a lot of players, myself included, this really is the moment Control begins to open up in both possibilities and gameplay. Despite getting launch and maintenance, the dusky lighting had a way of minimizing how visually satisfying it can be to toss the furniture around, but the research sector is so full of launchable everyday objects that it truly showcases how gorgeous this game can be. The clashing red haze of the hiss enemies against the green foliage neatly growing in what appears to be daylight means that everything is so much brighter, and the fluidity of combat is on full display here. It's that carnage of battle which makes everything feel so visceral. You can rip benches, plants, TVs, projectors, bins, and toss them about at your leisure. The visual design of the FBC still blocks of concrete means that all damage is almost always caused by the player. Few things are as satisfying as entering an open space with its meticulous layout and just shredding it. You don't just feel the chaos of combat during, but afterwards as well. I regularly stopped post-battle to just drink in just how messy I'd made everything. Remedy have continued to iterate on the particle physics of their previous titles, and this feels like the culmination of their best stuff. This works thematically as well. That contrast of order versus chaos is represented in the moment-to-moment decision-making of battle. An office space will look clean and tidy until Jesse enters as a force of nature to throw everything off balance. With all of this in mind, it's easy to describe Jesse as a reactive combatant. Remedy were desperate for the player to always be moving, always be dodging, always be aggressive. You're rewarded for being adventurous. Hiding from enemies should always be the least of a player's priorities. When you deal damage to a hiss, they'll drop that equivalent amount of health, and Remedy have fine-tuned Jesse's radius, so you need to pretty much stand on these little blue specks to hoover them up, meaning there's a risk-reward of getting into the thick of it so you can regain some of your HP. As a gameplay mechanic, this is fantastic. It keeps up the momentum of fights, and there's rarely any downtime once you enter a battle arena, but considering Remedy have been so particular about contextualizing everything in the oldest house, it's strange that Jesse's health pickups are never linked to the lore. Paul Erith, the game's lead designer, was all too aware of this, claiming, "This idea for how Jesse heals definitely came from a game design gameplay direction rather than a story one. We did put it through several different attempts. In the beginning, it was a giant white glowing orb, I think, and then it kind of changed form. Considering how consistent the red, white, and black aesthetic is in Control, having these shiny blue sparks representing health keeps them visually distinct. But as is always the case with healing systems which purely rely on dealing damage to foes, it impacts boss fights, pushing what should be big, cool moments to feel kind of underwhelming. Remedy have never had incredible bosses. In fact, it was one of their personal goals when designing Control to make memorable big bads to take down, but when Control and its DLC is over, you're left with a paltry 3 decent bosses: the Founder, Mold 1, and Hartman. We'll talk about those individually later, but here I want to focus our attention on Tomasi. Tomasi is Control's first boss fight. Prior to entering his arena, the player is given launch, so inevitably you'd think you're encouraged to throw objects at him while he flies about the shop. But elevated hiss have quicker reflexes than a nervous budgie, so there's a randomness to which launch attacks hit and which don't, strangely encouraging the player to use the service weapon instead. To bring it back to its health system, because the only way to heal is to hurt enemies, Control needs to infuse many of its boss fights with random grunts to take down so you have a fighting chance. These, combined with Mr. Floaty here's erratic nature, makes Tomasi and bosses like him irritating rather than challenging. And before you try to tell me that this is unfair and the likes of Tomasi and Salvador are mini-bosses, not real bosses, let me remind you that the Anchor falls into this pitfall as well, with it throwing charged hiss at you because it's so uninteresting in its own right. You'll probably notice that I've been discussing combat this whole time by using launch as my go-to example, and there's a good reason for that. It's the most interesting mechanic at Jesse's fingertips. Control provides options to the player, some really cool ones too, but rarely do enemies force you to use those options. We can pick up launch, seize, evade, shield, and levitate, and of course, there's the service weapon to fall back on in tough times. I've heard people describe Jesse's abilities outside of launch as lacking in their own right, that Remedy were unimaginative with Jesse's powers, and I see where they're coming from, but I've got to disagree. It's not that, say, Seize is a bad power-up, it's that Launch is the only ability which plays into that order versus chaos dichotomy. If you enter a battle arena and battle enemies without using Launch, the illustrious carnage is lacking, minimal. And when you have the option of launching a water cooler at a security guard for a badass powdery explosion, or seizing a guard to shoot at his friends, we all know which one we'd rather choose, especially when both use up that precious force meter. And a force meter is what it is. Control has a lot of similarities to Jedi Fallen Order, which is apt, seeing as both games came out within a couple of months of one another. At times, Jesse can feel like a Jedi, throwing objects around, operating Jedi mind tricks, and so on. Considering Remedy took a lot of influences from the Souls-like genre, removing a stamina bar and replacing it with a force meter was a smart way to make a player feel tactical and like they're managing resources during fights. But one of these abilities needed to be completely reworked. Evade. Evade should have been given to Jesse at the start of the game and shouldn't use up your force meter, or at the very least, there should be an upgrade you can apply to it which removes its use of the meter altogether. Evade draining your resources means you need to play it safe with your powers so you have a little bit left at the end to get out of the way of projectiles or charging hiss, which sneak up behind you and explode before you even have a chance to dodge. This goes against the all guns blazing approach the game encourages. And speaking of the exploding hiss, Jesse can get hurt by her own explosions. My go-to service weapon forms were the grip or the charge, lobbing rockets at enemies or sniping them from afar, but the service weapon does such little damage in contrast to the launch that it will always be a last resort. Charge, at the very least, gives the impression of great damage being done with its explosions, but the radius of these explosions can knock Jessie on her arse, which again is at odds with Control's aggressive tumble-in-the-mud strategy that's encouraged with the healing system. At times, the screen is so beautifully chaotic that you almost want to pause battle and jump into photo mode then and there, but that bold red colour palette that the game bathes in makes the explosiveness difficult to navigate, and it can be impossible to judge if you'll take friendly fire in the latter half of the game. Control smears itself with strangeness and oddities in its ideas and its lore, but the hiss, somehow, is a more underwhelming enemy than Alan Wake's dark presence, simply because its potential is so much greater than what the game offers. If we're using the art book as a reference point, Control's base game has 10 enemy types. Out of these 10, do you want to guess how many of them are guards with guns? 10 if you can. 4. The Hiss Guard, the Hiss Sniper, the Hiss Trooper, and the Hiss Ranger, and for the majority of your game time, Jessie will bash her head against these guys while managing other humanoid enemies like the Hiss Elevated and the Hiss Warped. Almost 50% of Control's monsters are guards with guns, and only a couple of its enemy types look inhuman. Ultimately, they're cannon fodder, not much of a threat at all, except to put pressure on the player while they battle the spongier enemies. The oldest house has unlimited potential for bizarre and weird ideas. There's a sentient rubber duck popping about for goodness sake, but by putting all of its eggs into the Hiss basket, it feels like Remedy limited itself, and as a result, the new weird gets undermined in our objectives. Though credit where credit is due, the Hiss clusters are a great example of where some enemy types require strategic thinking in the midst of battle. If you don't wipe a Hiss out early, they can be healed by that cluster which warps around the battlefield, making it a priority target for Jessie when she enters. I hesitate to call the Astral Spikes enemy types. They're more moving obstacles, but their erratic, ominous pursuit of Jessie as a bizarro hazard to keep in mind in some combat arenas. It's fantastic. It's unstoppable, always moving, and if it gets close, it drains Jessie of her full health bar. On her way to find Marshall, Jessie first meets one of these bad boys in an abandoned testing room, and the player needs to think fast to trap it in a black rock bunker before you can progress. At least one more enemy like this, something truly incalculable in the late game, would have broadened how dynamic fights can feel. Despite our baddies being uninteresting in their mechanics, they come with some really nice touches. The Hiss Elevated strapped to their chairs are designed this way because the Hiss attacked while experiments were being conducted on them in parapsychology. The Distorted Hiss are by far the creepiest and most deadly creatures Jessie goes up against, and when they appear, it's like a breath of fresh air because they're the most overtly monster-like creatures we see, and they demand you engage with the shield ability to counter their attacks before moving in to take them down. The Hiss as an entity is interesting. Seeing the office workers floating, their backs contorted during the early game hours, really reinforces this sense of corruption that Control's intent on examining. The oceanic imagery returns with their garbled words echoing off the stone walls. You want these waves to drag you away. Even after beating the game, the hiss still feels incomprehensible. Nowhere and everywhere all at once. But there are only so many Gatling gun enemies I can fight, and the inclusion of a shield bar makes them feel less like a true threat and more like a frustrating sponge, and further negates the service weapon in favour of launch. And speaking of the shields, we need to talk about the UI, but first, Jesse's finally found Marshall.
I'm Helen Marshall, head of Bureau Operations. Zachariah's dead then, and I assume you found his gun.
Just call me Jesse.
Want to see something cool? These were the original concept designs for Marshall, back when Remedy were exploring the FBC less as a black-tie bureau and more of a zany, fantastical organisation. She looks like an Emma Thompson character with her cape and fashionista glasses. As wacky as these designs were, I'm glad Remedy embraced the militarised look for Marshall. She's the one character Jesse meets who I think would knock her out in hand-to-hand combat, and the thick jacket enhances her no-nonsense attitude. She also represents everything about the Bureau Jesse came to expect when she first walked through the doors, and provides the only character conflict we see between Jesse and the FBC. Again, Jesse just wants to find Dylan, but Marshall refuses to help her until her soldiers are protected. I'd be happy with a full prequel about Marshall going out to a couple of Altered World events. Here, she sends Jesse off to Darling's HRA lab. If Marshall was reduced down to a part of game design, she'd be the combatant UI. Cold, clinical, comfortable in a military shooter, and enemies' health, shield status and level are indicated above their heads while they run around and try to blast at us. I hate this. Now, it's not a deal breaker, and this is purely subjective. The health bars are useful, they're stark and clear in the environments, and helps the player track the hiss during the explodey bits. It's also immersion breaking, and a clearer visual cue for the shields would have gone a long way, but I understand their necessity considering Control's visual style. My problem is with the numbers. I've gone on the record as discussing this before. More and more, we're seeing third-person action games adopt this homogenized strategy of popping an enemy level next to a grunt and increasing that level in scale with the player's own power. This signals to a player that this battle against a level 5 Hiss Guard is going to be no different to that battle against a level 1 Hiss Guard, except that the enemy has more health and will deal higher damage. What this means is that your tactical thinking doesn't need to change, but the fight will take longer and be more laborious. In other words, spongy. Control isn't an MMO. Remedy is a more creative studio than Ubisoft. Enemy levels waste the player's time, and by the 2/3 mark, Control has no more new baddies to test you on, so you're repeating the same old battles with the same old foes, except they've got a big, dumb number above their head. Some arbitrarily stronger enemies have titles as well, but this is unnecessary. I don't need to know that this guy is Senior Executive ID 2519-B, this tells me nothing other than the fact he's going to be spongy, and just like a sponge, is deflating to see it. Seeing as Remedy quote Dark Souls design so much during interviews about Control, imagine if you got to Anor Londo, and instead of gargoyles, you were fighting level 7 hollow pikemen. The number big and bold above their head. Do you think you'd like it half as much?
What do you know about Dylan Faden?
I knew this was coming. Lives are at stake here, and we need this machine working to save those lives. Once that is done, Director Faden, then we can talk.
Jesse, the princess is in another castle! Marshall's obstinance returns again when the HRA machine doesn't work. There's clearly a reluctant respect from Jesse. Up until now, she's truly felt out of her depth, specifically asking Marshall to call her by her first name rather than the title of director. And there's some really lovely subtle writing in how they find compromise in Marshall calling her instead. With Marshall directing Director Jesse to the Blackrock Quarry next, she opens a shortcut which loops us back around to Central Research, which means this is a good opportunity to talk about Control's best feature, the world and level design. SCP-087 is an unlit platform staircase based at the campus of... Current depth of the staircase is currently unknown. A light source is required for any subjects exploring SCP-087. As there are no lighting fixtures or windows present. Lighting sources brighter than 75 watts have shown to be ineffective, as SCP-087 seems to absorb excess light. Audio recordings confirm the distressed vocalizations from what is presumed to be a child. The source of these distress calls is estimated to be located approximately 200 meters below the initial platform. However, any attempts to descend the staircase have failed to bring subjects closer to the source. SCP-087 has undergone 4 video-recorded explorations by Class D personnel. Each subject conducting an exploration has encountered SCP-087-1, which appears as a face with no visible pupils, nostrils, or mouth. The nature of SCP-087-1 is entirely unclear, but it has been determined that it is not the source of the pleading. Subjects exhibit feelings of intense paranoia and fear when faced with SCP-087-1, but it is undetermined whether said feelings are abnormal or simply natural reactions.
Part 4. Jesse-vania.
We are about to be exposed to a different kind of resonance. Hostile, viral, invasive resonance.
At times, Control can feel structureless. It all flows into one grand adventure after the opening of the story. When you finally put the game down, the FBC's mystery isn't just a tangling web of ideas and plot threads and characters, but it's also like a mist. It's difficult to put events in order because of how the side missions appear, how backtracking is encouraged, how wispy the narrative feels. The ramshackle way information whooshes in and out of the story, not being built upon by Jesse, demands the player takes mental notes. But there is a structure. Each chapter opens with an ambient few shots, hinting at the insanity to come. Jesse methodically opens up floors of the oldest house as you progress. Each floor is further broken down by points of control, acting as the game's checkpoints. I love that these checkpoints have been considered in relation to the geometry of the space. They're even given a lore-specific purpose for existing, being scientific spaces the FBC have identified which can prevent the oldest house from shifting. Sometimes you'll find them in a wide open space, distinct and clear, but sometimes they'll be squashed up against a wall, battling with the oldest house's desire to shift. The level design is enamored with a full Metroidvania style. You'll regularly find areas you can't access and need to return to previous floors, like Jesse's doing now, travelling back to maintenance to gain access to the Black Rock Quarry. I've discussed the pillars of Metroidvania games on this channel before, but as a reminder, we commonly see great Metroidvanias follow 2 specific rules: opening up the world and building a better you. If you remember, truly affecting titles will have these 2 rules continuously complement each other. For example, in Hollow Knight, the Vengeful Spirit gives the player a strong ranged attack and opens up the world by granting us access to Greenpath. Control does have these rules complement each other sometimes. Specifically, Launch and Levitate are the 2 abilities which strengthen her moment-to-moment decision-making in combat, whilst also granting access to new areas, but the most common way that the oldest house opens up is through clearance cards. At the end of most chapters, an FBC employee will slouch up to her, slap a clearance card in her hands, and bid Jesse on her way. A perfect example is the Black Rock Quarry itself. We slot a level 5 keycard in and that's the end of the story. But Control gets away with this because of the FBC. Of course, there would be clearance cards locking off some of the game's content. In fact, it would be strange if that wasn't the case, and this form of exploration shows off Remedy's greatest priority when designing the game: contextualizing everything, narratively or thematically. The dullness of swiping a level 5 keycard is contrasted with the amazement on the other side. The mundane clashes messily with the fantastical, and it's satisfying to see every time. Speaking of the fantastical, I never thought a quarry would make me audibly wow like Owen Wilson, but hot damn. That moment when it dawns on you that this is where the FBC's most precious material, the thing that acts as their security gates, their fire extinguishers, their shelters, comes from this natural rock growing in their basement. The glittering sheen of the rocks reflect off the stars in the night sky in such a beautiful way that it's easily one of the most breathtaking natural scenes in the game. Remedy have returned to their NASA maps to ensure the constellations are accurate, the same way they did in Alan Wake. It's a tiny detail which you aren't going to notice and I'm not going to notice, but like I said in that video, it adds to the impact of the magical realism, an awareness that they cared so much. Here's what Leonardo Calamati said about the process. Painting the skybox was a long and painful process. We couldn't use copyrighted images at all, so I had to research for days to gather a series of pictures of constellations and nebulas at high enough resolution to be used. I had to paint over the stars one by one. The Black Rock Quarry is just one example, but playing Control, you need to regularly remind yourself that you are in a government building. It's the variety which gets you. The shimmering roughness of the Black Rock Quarry contrasts with the burgundy walls and carpets of the executive sector, which contrasts the sinister reds of the Hiss, which contrasts the greenery of the research sector, which contrasts with the primary yellows of luck and probability, which contrasts with the... Each battle arena has been considered in relation to how it would exist prior to the invasion of the Hiss. A mailroom, an entrance hall, a stairwell, all of them with eerie little stories to tell, and this, above all else, is where Control wins its player over, in the ideas, the detail. Something as simple as a communication department has a dead letters section with an overflowing river of correspondence from people describing the ghosts of presidents, or a man claiming he's built God. It's the complexity which stands out, how sectors interact with each other in relation to the Bureau's research. You would imagine that all of the really cool stuff would live in the research sector, but that's just the starting point for the FBC's process. Creating a government building where weird shit happens is easy. Creating a government organization which has lived and breathed that building while creating specific regulations which are reflected in the level narration is insane. Because Control's weirdness, for better or for worse, isn't in the enemy types, or the characters, or even the gameplay. We've seen all of this before. It's in the meticulousness, in the stuff you'll likely miss if you just rush through the game's story. Whilst maintenance is visually uninteresting in contrast to, say, the Panopticon or the Black Rock Quarry, there's a bizarre amount of natural light seeping in, despite being in the basement. The power plant has the body of the previous director floating around inside of it. Blink and you might miss this stuff between the chaos of destroying these spaces and locations. There's a lot to criticize with Control, but anyone who describes the game as boring isn't paying attention. If you take the time to study something as inconsequential as a whiteboard, you'll find new angles on previously established ideas. This whiteboard here looks at shoeboxes and how they may protect OOPs, lending further credence to the shoebox in Alan Wake which held the clicker. Did that shoebox somehow contain the clicker until Alan needed it later in his story? It raises further questions and theories just from walking around, and that is something which I don't think you get anywhere else outside of From Software's deep lore. That'll be the last time I reference Dark Souls. No promises though. What's so impressive is how Control's levels are designed for both horizontal and vertical play. Attending to an area like the research sector for the first time demands the use of the staircases, funneling Jessie into linear corridors and forcing her to manage her enemies. But if you return to this area with levitates later on, you can reach the top floor with ease and snipe the Hiss from afar. The oldest house's shifting, blunt nature lends credence to these spaces still feeling realistic and bizarre.
Here, this will lead back to Central Research.
I've noticed a common criticism of the oldest house's exploration that the game doesn't provide shortcuts to uncover. It's a fair point, but I disagree that it's necessarily a problem. On one hand, it is a shame that Remedy didn't utilise the shifting nature of the oldest house to find a clever workaround regarding shortcuts. Aside from this single loop back to Central Executive, which Marshall opens up for us, there are almost none. However, I believe that level design shortcuts would undercut Control's world design. If Jessie's evolution as a character is to embrace her role as director by the end of the tale, then it stands to reason that the player should feel like they work for the FBC before the credits roll. The oldest house may have always existed, it may be a portal to another world, it may even be sentient and ready to devour us all, but it is, from the second Jessie's feet cross the threshold, the home of the Federal Bureau of Control, and with the Bureau comes a dimness to everyday work. Forcing the player to backtrack simulates this. I run down this corridor, then I take a right, another right, and up a flight of stairs. Rather than circumnavigating our backtracking with shortcuts a la makes this feel like a 9 to 5, only with fast travel to loosen the tedium. Similarly to Jedi Fallen Order, your map isn't quite as useful as you'd initially hope. There's no mini-map unless you bring up this blocky floor map, too obscure to help all that much. Where Cal's adventure used the Star Wars aesthetic to produce a sketchy, obtuse map which was so useless that you had to focus on your orienteering skills, Control uses diegesis as its guiding star. Just like any government building, there are signs everywhere, signaling where to go, what floor you're on, but also like a government building, these can be more ambiguous than they initially seem. I think we've all had that experience in, say, a hospital where a sign tells you to go right, but in front of you are 4 rights, and the sign actually meant the second corridor of those 4. Control does that at a few points. Polaris will pulse behind a wall, and you'll be standing there considering the signposts you saw previously, just thinking, "Yeah, I see you, Polaris, but how do I get to you?" This sounds like a criticism, but I personally see it as the complete opposite. I want to get lost in the oldest house. Turning a corner and stumbling into Luck and Probability or the Synchronicity Lab is some of the most fun I've had with a game, and forcing the player to think about the oldest house as a real space makes those shocking wackadoo reveals even more impactful because you're so immersed in the FBC's world. In the past, Remedy have used weenies to illustrate to the player where they need to go and what their long-term objectives are, but with Control, they've ironically thought grander. Control was designed with the philosophy of an open-world game. The world design director, Stuart MacDonald, who's Scottish by the way, freedom, started to design sectors and levels the same way you'd visually design villages in an open world. Spatial relationship was key for them, ensuring that the architecture of the oldest house remained consistent and believable. There would be key spaces that a player would pass through often, and then the other spaces would grow out more organically. To quote MacDonald directly, it's supposed to be like a village square with the surrounding streets and buildings. But to make all of this work, to make every new area feel remarkable and memorable, Remedy's level design almost always concentrates on single point perspective. Stanley Kubrick is best known for this, where the subject is framed in the middle of a shot, with symmetrical scenery framing it. We see this most regularly whenever Jesse visits the astral plane. The board's inverted black pyramid is the first thing we see. You know immediately what you're aiming for and where it is in relation to the space. There's a slight shift in perspective upon entering certain areas, which helps here. During regular gameplay, the camera is a little to one side so that Jesse doesn't cover the center of the screen, but sometimes there's a subtle camera shift which places her precisely in the center, framing the scene in a more symmetrical, single-point perspective. It's subtle, but it's fucking sick.
I promised I'd tell you about Dylan once you helped us. We brought him here after the Odd-inary event. He was groomed to be the future director. He had talents far beyond any other candidate in the program.
Of course he did.
So you kidnapped him.
Slow down, Jesse, you'll hurt yourself. So with Jesse retrieving what she needs from the Black Rock Quarry, Marshall finally agrees to tell her what she came to learn. It turns out that Dylan has been codenamed P6, and the Bureau was priming him to take over from Trench as a future director. This is one of a small handful of moments where Jesse begins to get angry at last, but just as the conflict between Jesse and Marshall seems to be reaching some narrative purpose, Marshall pieces out to go and live in the Foundation DLC. And with what Jesse's about to learn, you'd think she'd start to rage against the FBC a little. She doesn't. SCP-040 is a human child capable of manipulating the physical characteristics of living organisms. Modifications are primarily cosmetic, ranging from simple color and pattern changes to more involved shifts in bodily form and structure. Modifications are limited to what would be physically possible. For example, while SCP-040 can grant an organism wings that does not naturally possess them, they will not permit the creature to fly without meeting other physical requirements. SCP-040's abilities require significant focus and time to enact and cause intense headaches and nausea when performed for more than a few minutes. The effect becomes increasingly unreliable and inaccurate the smaller the modifications or more complex the changes are. SCP-040's emotional state is within acceptable boundaries for an individual of its age group, accounting for the effects of prolonged containment and parental separation. Subject's intelligence is slightly above average for its age group. Behavior is generally cooperative. SCP-040 acclimatized quickly to containment and responded well to the initial orientation and socialization programs. SCP-040 responds to the name 40 and does not appear to have any other given or chosen personal name.
Part 5.
Just stay with me, okay? I could use a friend right now.
We are over halfway through the game, with Jesse gearing up to investigate the Panopticon in search of Dylan, which makes it really weird that it's now that the board chooses to tell us how astral constructs work.
Yeah, I know, board. Jesus Christ.
In other words, Control waits until the 60% mark to explain upgradables and loot to us, and if there was one thing I would cut from Control, it would be this. I struggle to put into words how much I hate this messy, counterintuitive, faux RPG glop of a system, but while Jesse scales the Panopticon, I'll try. The comparisons to Jedi Fallen Order continue in Control's loot system. Turning the corner in the oldest house has these odd space boxes waiting for Jesse to kick open, which will give us random junk like entropic echoes or undefined readings or soggy spanners, inane terms which mean absolutely little, both in the context of Control's world building and in relation to their mechanics. At least Fallen Order had the good grace to make its collectibles a little bit exciting, a new poncho or a new paint job for BD1. With Control, there's no explicit difference between an intrusive pattern and a remote thought, the correlation between the names of these materials and what they actually create. We know that, for instance, a corrupted sample is needed to upgrade the spin weapon, but why this is the case, or even a hint as to where to collect them, isn't available in the game world. Some materials are in the maintenance floor, some of them are just in investigations, but unless you have a Reddit thread open next to you, it will be impossible to tell the difference between what's useful and what isn't. Ah, yes, I need to collect 2 more undefined readings. I know what and where they are! I've been playing some recently, so with Control's inspirations in mind, let's look at an easy comparison. From Software's first Souls game is criticised for the encyclopedic breadth of the upgrade materials you need to collect if you're aiming for a specific character build. Where Dark Souls simplified its upgrades by making them all one substance, Titanite, Demon Souls has far too many. Hard stones, sharp stones, clear stones, marrow stones, and so on. But what makes Demon Souls' upgrade system more forgivable than Control's is that Demon Souls, at least, makes sense. Dragonstone is used to upgrade dragon weapons, sharp stones upgrade sharp weapons like swords, hard stones upgrade blunt weapons like clubs. With a service weapon to my head, I couldn't tell you for the life of me what a fucking astral blip is used for, meaning when you venture off the beaten path in Control and find one of these boxes, the player's satisfaction is, at best, passive. Oh, I got a thing. Okay. And when I say I want Control to embrace the weird more, this isn't what I mean. Naming your upgrade materials random terms to differentiate unnecessarily is the opposite of weird, because this system isn't unique, and it isn't new, it's tired and sickly. It's a cyst which has been bolted onto a lot of modern game design. At the risk of sounding absolutist, I think it's one of the more poisonous mechanics we've seen in the 8th generation outside of microtransactions, and we keep seeing it again and again. I've been returning to this approach to loot and gear a lot lately. In the past few years, people have started to refer to games built around the system as gacha games, pulling from the Japanese toy vendors, but gacha is a fluffy name. Too fluffy. I think it deserves a better descriptor. Goot, short for garbage loot. I think it's a suitable word. It's short, it's dumb, it feels kinda gross to say, it has very sticky connotations, like a slime enemy in a fantasy game. Goot. Goot is the type of gear a player can acquire through play, which doesn't necessarily strengthen the player character. Say I have a Jessie, which is pretty strong. She's got a level 4 health boost, a level 4 damage boost, and a level 4 shield strength. I go into Control's menu and decide to use my Spooky Raisin and my Space Hobbit to build a new mod. I've made a conscientious choice to come out of the oldest house, to stop the combat, or the exploration, or the lore reading, to go into my menu and try to make Jessie stronger. But then I craft a level 2 damage boost. What have I achieved from this? What satisfaction has been added to the game feel? What fun is there here? The answer is none. Instead, all that's happened is I've wasted my time. Jessie picks up so much Goot during her time in the game that you'll spend as much time holding triangle to dismantle it as you will actually fighting the hiss. It's bloat, that's all. A good upgrade system is supposed to be integral to any sense of player growth, but the personal and weapon mods add so little that it's barely noticeable. Their percentage increases. Your service weapon reloads 12% faster. You get a 5% health boost. These are useful in theory, but combat is so fast and anarchic that you won't notice a difference with or without these mods, meaning they are not a reward for exploration. I would take an FBC budget report over a weapon mod any day of the week. By the halfway point, I started to be disappointed by finding the space boxes. I've battled through hordes of hiss, down a service tunnel, unlocked a hidden area, the words popping up crystal clear in the bottom of the screen, but my gameplay reward is a level 3 shield boost, when I already have a level 5. Who does this system benefit? It's not even a question of Control improving or iterating on this system. The Goot system should have been scrapped altogether, instead focusing on more fresh abilities, the skill tree, and experience points. Sometimes that's enough. You want your player to be thinking about craftables and loot as little as possible because it pulls them away from the game's excellent atmosphere and makes their thinking more granular. Control excels when the player is thinking philosophically, solving mysteries, experiencing the weird, not sludging through old, tired systems which should have been abandoned years ago.
Right. Well, okay. Hello, I'm Frederick Langston, the Panopticon Supervisor. It's not the best time for a tour. We have hiss everywhere, numerous cell breaches, and system failures across the board, but you're the director, so here we go.
Speaking of experiencing the weird, hi Langston, you funny little man. So to get to Dylan, Jesse first needs to contain a rogue Benikoff TV, which is causing havoc in the Panopticon. This is where all the objects of power are kept, a mammoth vertical tube in the lower recesses of the oldest house. That clashing of mundane and weird returns here, with Langston contrasting nicely with the man-eating fridge, the flying TV, or a swan boat which doesn't like to be ridden. The guy is a job's worth. He just wants the hiss to be dealt with before 5 PM so he can get home to feed his cat. Whilst I understand that the FBC and the oldest house is more than just the objects of power and altered items stored within it, it's the Panopticon which really stands out as one of my favourite areas because this is the stuff I cared about. Seeing the supernatural in action, learning about the containment procedures, what remedies demented imaginations could conjure up, like a Christmas tree which mimics the speech of anyone near it until they go mad. And it's in this sector that we get to learn a couple of new abilities, so let's talk about that. I really like the system at the heart of Control's power set. Needing to cleanse an OOP which has gotten free, absorbing its powers and then being pooped into the astral plane for a brief tutorial keeps the execution brief but tailored. After about 5 minutes, you fully understand what makes that power up useful and where you should use it. It also gives Jessie some further face time with the board. Where Control could have taken the easy way out and just had the board send these powers to her at specific plot moments, Control hides about 50% of its powers away from the main narrative in optional rooms and side quests. My favourite by far is how we obtain the shield. Racing against the clock through an FBC obstacle course shows us the kind of training regimen the security team needed to go through themselves, and when we finally cleanse the safe, it feels earned.
So I just read this? Welcome to the Ranger Field Training course. The course must be completed in the specified amount of time. When you're ready to start, press the button.
Upgrading these abilities keeps the player incentivized with combat and side missions, as well as the tried and true method of experience points. Some of these unlockable powers are really satisfying to use, adding new dimension to combat, like the ground slam you can unlock for levitate, or the option to launch 3 objects at an enemy rather than just 1. The skill tree is streamlined, so you don't need to waste hard-won XP on a damage boost to Jesse's melee attack just to unlock, say, more health points, but by the end of the game, you feel like you've had a say in how your Jesse plays because of how the skill tree has been engineered, and it firmly encourages going off the beaten path and into the side missions. Further into the Panopticon, Jesse begins to see the dark underbelly of the FBC. We learn about how Dylan was raised all of these years. It's strongly hinted that his only entertainment was the nauseating Threshold Kids episodes. He was locked in a glass case with 24/7 surveillance. They treated him like an animal, and just as she finds Dylan's cell empty and smashed, Pope gives Jesse a call to say that, remarkably, Dylan has just walked into Central Executive and turned himself in. To return to Control's greatest influence, the SCP are often coloured as grey as granite through the community stories that we read, and the Federal Bureau of Control is no different. Dylan has the potential to be very, very dangerous, but the FBC have reared a monster in the darkness of the oldest house. What always really sticks out is this interview that we hear.
What day is it tomorrow?
Fuck off! I don't know! There is no calendar! How can I fucking know?
Dylan, calm down.
Fuck you! Fuck you and fuck Casper!
The interviewer berates Dylan, throwing question after question at him. What day is it? What day is it? And every time he reacts with a very honest, understandable answer. He doesn't know because they don't even give him a calendar. When Dylan grows upset, they call security on him, and then they make it sound like it's his problem when he lashes out. There's a lot wrong with how Control's narrative is paced, but here, the game crafts an extremely sympathetic villain in Dylan.
Do you know who I am?
Oh, you know me. Say it.
You are Dylan Faden's sister.
He's talking in the third person.
When Jesse finally meets Dylan, she comes face to face with her own failure. She carries a lot of guilt with her, seeing him in a cell again, corrupted by a hostile entity which he encouraged to take him. And with that guilt, you'd think Jesse would project some frustration back onto the FBC, but she doesn't. Her long-lost brother has been imprisoned and experimented on for over a decade. This is powerful stuff, but she barely blinks. The one source of conflict, Marshall, has buggered off, so she doesn't seem to raise an eyebrow at how Dylan was treated. It's by far the most jarring moment for her characterization in the game, and it's only really disappointing because the build-up to Dylan has been so affecting. But a conversation about Dylan necessitates a conversation about the Hiss, because it's in this cell that we hear more of that strange incantation they've been droning for the majority of the game. The similarities between the Hiss and the Dark Presence are more than they seem. They both examine the relationship between the odd and the ordinary. Odd-inary. SCP-2598, a large yellow underwing moth wearing a small helmet. Apart from this and its behaviour, no other anomalous characteristics are discernible. It is able to communicate with humans by colliding with their heads in a pattern consistent with American Morse code. While SCP-2598 is apparently able to hear and understand English, it is only able to communicate to return message in this manner, despite having been offered specially designed automatic translation pads with which it could collide. SCP-2598 has thus far seemed either unable or unwilling to use any such device. During conversation, SCP-2598 will invariably attempt to redirect the conversation towards a sales pitch for specifically a helmet designed for moths. For example, "It was like a door being opened before me, Doctor, and I could see the light. It was all possible because of Moth Helm, which you yourself can own today for as little as 3 easy payments of $19.99.
Part 6. Odd-inary.
This is an ordinary song about an ordinary girl from an ordinary town. It's the ordinary story.
Dylan encourages Jesse to explore the oldest house further, specifically the Prime Candidate program, promising her that she should be able to find the slide projector we've been looking for there. With him being overcome by the hiss, it's uncertain whether or not we can trust him, but Jesse has no other leads to go on and decides to investigate further. So let's talk about the hiss as an entity. Outside of combat, the hiss can be an extremely unnerving enemy. The bodily contortions we see in some of the enemy designs show that when Remedy commits, it can eke out some really gratifying horror. When I discussed Alan Wake, I noted that as spooky as that game can be, it often fell into horror's greatest sin, announcing the frights. Control announces nothing to the player about anything. Each space of the oldest house will have motion detectors which will flash an injured red light when the hiss appear, but this is your only warning, making combat feel more organic. But the hiss as an entity has a lot of similarities to Alan Wake's dark presence in its behaviour. It takes over human beings, corrupting them. Most of the time, the hiss's victims will remember basic physical functions like how to fire a gun or swing a baton. It parrots recognisable as it comes for Jesse. I really like this for one reason and one reason only, because we learn in the AWE expansion that Alan Wake probably created the hiss. The incantation the hiss recites is a Dadaist poem written by Wake. Typically this comes in the form of individual letters and symbols being rearranged to form new words and sounds, but Wake cut up sentences, put them in a shoebox, and pulled the words out to form the murmurs we hear. You are a worm through time. The thunder song distorts you. Happiness comes. We know that Alan Wake has been writing and writing escape attempts while lost in the darkness for the past decade, and some of his attempts have, it seems, resulted in various OOPs and AWEs which the FBC needs to contain. God, there are a lot of acronyms in this game. So inevitably, the writer would pull from an inspiration to create a new evil entity, and where better than the Dark Presence, a force he knows all too well and which still haunts his nightmares. The hiss and the Dark Presence are not the same entity, that's not what I'm saying, but it's an interesting explanation nevertheless. In justifying the weird like this, Control could be accused of making the odd ordinary, but I disagree. In fact, I think it's in the oddness that Control's strengths truly lie. Control's humanity lies in its examination of trauma. Jessie is traumatized by the abduction of her brother, shaping her to be morose and guilt-ridden. Dylan is traumatized by his treatment at the hands of the FBC, and it's broken him. Director Trench, prior to his suicide, is traumatized by the death of his family, and his exposure to the hiss exploits that trauma to make him more paranoid. The FBC, as an organisation, is all too aware of the traumatizing effects their research into the supernatural entails, and they combat this by cloaking themselves in rigorous mundanity. Dullness is a protection from harmful entities like the hiss. The Bureau's rules, often portrayed as the butt of some joke, keep malevolence at bay, but there's a necessary evil in the FBC's bureaucracy. Secrets lead to conspiracy, to corruption, and it leads to the oldest house being traumatized by the hiss's corrupting influence. If the oldest house was just weird for weirdness' sake, without any grounding banality to contrast the bizarre, it would undercut its shocking moments. We've already discussed the oldest house in its level design and detail, but we haven't taken the time to really embrace why it's such a wonder to behold. So before we continue, a quick disclaimer. I know brick all about architecture. I don't know anything about Frank Gehry's work, why Renzo Piano won the Pritzker Prize, or who Bjark Ingels is, other than the fact his J is in the wrong place. Bark Jingles has a better ring to it. I couldn't tell you what a balustrade is, or a Corinthian order. I don't know my Muntin from my Ogi Arch, but when I played Control, I knew that the architecture of the oldest house was the most fascinating thing about the game. The sharp geometry of the arenas, the stark colours, the personification of mundane spaces, it made me want to do some research. So, research I did, and one word kept popping up again and again. Brutalism. Brutalist architecture emerged during the 1950s in the United Kingdom, among the reconstruction projects of the post-war era, characterised by minimalist constructions that showcase the bare building materials and the structural elements over decorative design. At their core, they're designed to be impenetrable, inspired by the Blitz in World War II, an attempt to make erect buildings which couldn't be shattered by just one bomb. They're more akin to a Bond villain's headquarters rather than, say, a university, but this is a style we see in universities, just look at Yale's art building. It's also a style which apparently is super polarizing among architects. Some think it's ugly and blunt, others think it's having a bit of a renaissance, that these buildings have the ability to make a statement, rather than just serve their single functional, protective purpose. That if you look past the mundanity of its features, you can find something special, something fresh, something unique. Brutalism as a style is very easy to get wrong. Stuart MacDonald described it as essentially sculpture. You can't hide things and you can't add things on top. It's very pure architecture. You have to get the proportions and the sense of weight right, otherwise it doesn't look good. It's challenging because of its simplicity. MacDonald was brought into the project purely because of his background as an architect. He had to hold seminars with Remedy's artists to teach them about mass and physicality in brutalist design. That impenetrable thickness had to be believable to make Control's atmosphere work. Real-life examples like Boston City Hall's double waffle ceiling were strapped up in Remedy's offices as consistent reference points. Because brutalist architecture is so still, so unmoving, it makes the Hiss's corrupting influence stand out. The warping haze which accompanies the Hiss invading a space, the jagged, malleable textures, are so much more powerful than bright, red lighting.
Holy shit.
It isn't until Jesse cleanses a control point that we see the before and after. She wipes away the trauma of the Hiss infection on a space, resetting it to be still and clean and smooth, leaving the player with an immediate sense of safety and satisfaction through the repetitive act of reaching a checkpoint. Harmony has been restored. To keep that immersion consistent, Remedy even applies that beefiness to its UI. Entering a new area stamps the name in sharp, blocky letters. The closest Control ever gets to really announcing something is when it explodes with the name of a new sector in this cold, clinical way, like it's saying, yeah, here you go, this is the research sector, don't ask questions. There's something powerful about names in Control. The Hiss doesn't have a name until Jesse gives it one, and Pope clings to this because it gives her security. An ordinary, everyday thing like naming grants the human consciousness the ability to develop an emotional attachment to it.
I can pick up this pencil, tell you its name is Steve, and go like this. Oh. And part of you dies. Just a little bit on the inside.
This ties to the collective unconscious, one of Control's more powerful ideas. The sense that over stretches of time, human beings attach collective properties to an object or a place, so much so that it can be opened up to having paranormal capabilities. The Hiss even tries to rid Dylan of his name, having him refer to himself in the third person as P6, to try and strap him of his ability to fight back, and considering Remedy's affinity for on-the-nose naming, Max Payne, Alan Wake, Bright Falls, and so on, it's clearly a philosophy Sam Lake lives by with his storytelling. Speaking of on-the-nose names, Jesse's finally made it to the FBC's recreation of her hometown, Odd-inary. This is one of Control's most understated set pieces, and it doesn't even do anything that strange mechanics-wise. Tearing apart the model of Odd-inary and throwing buildings at Hiss as they come for Jesse is one of the game's most memorable moments. Through collectibles, we learn about the slide projector's ability to open doors into other dimensions, that this is where Polaris came from, that using it as children transformed a childhood friend into a monstrosity, and that they came face to face with an entity called the Not Mother. There is a disappointment to how Control relies on the player's imagination to do all the heavy lifting with this though. We don't get to see any of it in action. Particularly the Not Mother is a being which I would have liked to see rather than have described to me in Bureau documents, but perhaps it's something we'll see in a later sequel.
It's just one large-scale HRA. It's an easy choice, no choice. It's there now. Protecting the most important thing from what's coming.
This is yet another dead end for Jesse in her hunt for the slide projector. Darling has taken it to another one of his many labs, and in order to get to it, Jesse will need to navigate the ashtray maze. She's visited by Atty, who tells her to come and see him as he has a gift for her, and this is where Control began to really lose me. The problem is that the game can't seem to make its mind up on if it's a character study of Jesse or not. As I mentioned before, so much of this is just one big fat excuse to tour the oldest house, but when all is said and done, the Hiss invasion, the fallout of the FBC, the catalyst for the adventure, it all revolves around Jesse and her past. It was her who found the slide projector, it's her brother the FBC took that day. Everything comes back to Jesse, which means that her inconsistency as a character begins to show face more than we'd like. On the subject of the Odd-inary, Mikhail Karuzinin noted, "There's this conflict of collision of the strange and mundane. What made it interesting is you'd see something familiar that you can recognise and understand, like an elevator, but then as you use it, you discover that something else, something more complicated is going on that you're trying to understand." The game, structurally, is ritualistic. There's repetition in our micro goals of entering a new area, battling some Hiss, and cleansing each control point, in keeping with the FBC's reliance on rituals in their containment procedures. The beauty of this is that it isn't just an aesthetic part of the world, it's mechanical as well. The man-eating fridge is sterilised with an incantation. The Ocean View Motel returns to a neat puzzle relating to the rule of 3. Every time Jesse crosses into the threshold, you need to read the obscure environmental details to ring a bell 3 times or turn off 3 electronic devices. Something is new every time Jesse travels through here, and whilst they're hardly serious brain teasers, they're neat and contextual. Everything in Control adheres to a rule of some sort, and you have to applaud Remedy's tenacity. In less capable hands, the weird of the oldest house would apply the randomness of a mid-2000s scene kid, but the weird always follows laws and logic. Sometimes that's all you need for a decent puzzle. But Control's true puzzle lies in unlocking the oldest house itself and uncovering its secrets, and the game balances downtime, exploration, and combat almost meditatively. There's plenty of time for the player to think about what they're reading, what they're seeing. Reaching the bottommost sector of the oldest house, the Foundation, Jesse needs to ride over this barren chasm in a sketchy looking railcar. Video games have taught us over the years that we should prepare for a long battle with aerial enemies on a small platform, but no. Instead we get a lovely, long, contemplative section with a Finnish tango playing.
Did you miss me? Did you have peace in your song?
Yes.
No. Pardon, you can borrow it. The song is a present from my friends to you.
It's this phrase, "from my friends to you," which stands out most to me. Atty hands Jesse a cassette player which will help her navigate the ominous ashtray maze, but who are his friends? The board? Is Atty an avatar for the board, or does he just serve them? We hear more and more during our exploration how Atty is revered and feared by the FBC, but he stays as mysterious as he first appeared by the time the credits roll. I think that when a sequel does rear its head, he will make a return, potentially as a villain, considering the DLC hints that Jesse will be at odds with the board in the future. With music in hand, Jesse's ready to hit the endgame, but not before we do a little bit of cleanup. SCP- has the appearance of a portable media player device known as a Walkman. When the play button is pressed while the subject is wearing earphones, the subject is placed into an unconscious state, and the device seems to interface with the brain to place subjects in a dreamlike state. In this state, all subjects report manifesting in a concrete corridor. In this corridor, there are steel door frames to each side of the subject at random intervals. The number of steel door frames varies for each subject. In these door frames, no adjoining room can be seen. Instead, there is a transparent, plasmic substance. Through this substance, each subject reports observing a place or event that they have seen before. When a subject attempts to pass through the substance, the subject will pass into the image of a memory, which begins to happen, as it did in reality. After a memory event has concluded, the subject will experience loss of vision. To end the vision, a stop button on SCP must be pressed. Note: if the stop button is pressed in reality while a subject is unconscious, the subject's brain function will cease completely, causing immediate death. Idiots.
Part 7. Take control.
Expedition 3. We located the source of the resonance in Slidescape 36. It is an entity, a living organism of a considerable mass. I've named it Hedron based on its physical shape.
The oldest house wasn't built around the side missions. The side missions were built around the oldest house. With a big, empty, shape-shifting government building, there's a lot of potential to fill the player's mission log with some really cool stuff, but the side quests are hit or miss. On one hand, you have Arish's request for Jesse to go and eliminate his old security team who have been infected with the Hiss. This involves returning to old areas we've already explored in full, killing a Hiss with a big health bar and a name above its head, and moving on to the next one. It's busy work, with an objective so generic that it literally says, eliminate Hiss Guy for one of them. Yes, I know the soldier's name is Guy, but it's still stupid. On the other hand, we have the Founder's boss fight. You know the one, every other critic has discussed it at length. We find this poor sap has been on an 18-hour shift staring at this refrigerator. If he blinks, it will eat him. Jesse arrives to relieve him of his duties, but she's too late and ultimately gets sucked into this bleak, dark version of the astral plane where the Founder makes its appearance. It's a great boss fight, and the Founder's design gives us everything I wanted and more from encountering new entities in the oldest house. You need to keep an eye on your surroundings because the bastard thing will break the floor beneath you, meaning with the camera angled upwards towards your enemy, it's easy to trip into the abyss for a one-hit kill. It is annoying, but what it does is necessitates the use of Jesse's levitate ability to gain the upper hand, and any boss which necessitates new mechanics to make your life easier is a strong one in my book. Langston's various missions where you need to hunt down rogue objects continues this trend. Experiencing the weird and wonderful ways in which the strange can manifest is exactly what Control needs more of. A teleporting rubber duck, mannequins which can duplicate, forcing the player to look for visual cues. Underhill's side quest is clearly supposed to be tackled either in the post-game or just before Jesse's final mission. The dizzying green haze of the pit gives the player a full optional area with brand new enemy types and a boss in the form of Mold 1, and it's a perfect example of how structureless Control can feel, and why that's not always necessarily a bad thing. Tripping into a big battle in a strange new area with a brand new entity is one of the ways Control makes Jesse's adventure with the Hiss feel like a drop in the ocean. But again, the literal objective of this area is stagnant. We need to run around and find 6 mold samples. Whoopee. And even then, the hints we're given aren't all that useful. Mold that grows near toilets? I don't know, man, this looks like a toilet to me. Where's the mold? And where that homogenized mission design becomes most clear is in the fucking bureau alerts. I know I'm not alone in this, but it needs to be said. These need to be cut from the game. During intriguing investigation or hard-hitting story beats, your screen will be interrupted with one of these. A timed message from the board ordering Jesse to travel to some other part of the oldest house to kill a small handful of nameless grunts. They're meandering nonsense. Not only do they distract from the really interesting stuff, they provide the player very little in the form of rewards, regularly giving us a single ability point, upgrade materials or weapons modifications which are too weak for our current level. They exist just to pad out Control's length and infuse Jesse with Goot. And Control is already a long game. It doesn't need these boring additions to extend our playtime. It breaks my heart to see a title which is so visionary in its design philosophy bow to the whims of AAA game design like this, adding dull, overplayed systems like procedurally generated missions, all in an effort to say that the game can be played forever. But I don't want to play Control forever. I don't want to play any game forever, and being interrupted with bullshit like this barely makes me want to finish the story.
I'm averse to using objects of power. I don't want to lean on things I ultimately can't trust. But the ashtray and the cigarette, smoking there forever, have their uses.
The ashtray maze is the product of Director Trench binding himself to an object of power, namely an ashtray with an ever-burning cigarette in it and an engraving of a maze on its base. It's another example of the game's excellent level narration. It's not just a shifting space. Trench created this as a result of his infectious paranoia, just desperate to hide the slide projector and dimensional research from the rest of the Bureau. This thing is why Pope didn't know the slide projector existed. Navigating it is one big fat rock and roll jamboree, with Poets of the Fall, or rather the old gods of Asgard, serenading Jesse's mission as she rips through hordes of Hiss who have gotten lost in its halls. This is Control's rock concert moment. The enemies are so underleveled that the player can cleave through them in 1 or 2 hits, with lamps, chairs and desks nearby to satisfyingly tear the space to shreds. It's a section I could replay over and over again and never tire of, primarily because of Remedy's everlasting relationship with Poets of the Fall, bringing out some of their best songs. It feels like a friggin' Doom title at points. Unfortunately, with the exception of one standout moment coming up, it's kind of all downhill from here. Control's closing hour is the wettest of farts. In an effort to keep everything understated and naturalistic in its bizarreness, the story begins to feel void of catharsis. It's hard to feel like it ends, even when the credits roll. We don't get nearly long enough in dimensional research for a start. Just a couple of offices and a long corridor, despite the red sand bleeding into this reality being really interesting. We learn teases of the expedition Darling and Trench went on. Trench, presumably because of his para-utilitarian abilities, was overcome with this humming resonance which drove some of their crew mad, which explains the drumming noise we hear from the Hiss prior to combat. We witness Darling's final message, that he learned something, was exposed to something which made him willingly disappear, presumably into another plane. That's some compelling setup. Shame it's not fleshed out any further or even referenced in the DLC. Everything comes to a head when Jesse finds Hedron, and this might be the first time a Remedy game confused me and I didn't thank them for it.
Hi. I made it.
So, what the hell is happening here? It's suggested that Polaris reached out to Jesse through the slide projector when she was a child and bound itself to her. Hedron came through the slide projector as well, the same slide as Polaris, only years later. Jesse states that Polaris and Hedron are one and the same, but are they? Or are they two separate entities? After being exposed to Hedron, Darling began to believe that some threat was soon going to come to the oldest house, so he developed HRAs to protect the staff. So did Hedron specifically warn Darling about the Hiss? How did it know the Hiss was coming? Gaming University has a fantastic run of videos on some real-world theories behind Control's science fiction. I've linked him below, but one of his most interesting theories focuses on how Polaris and Hedron relate to brain frequency. Ultimately, Hedron amplifies Polaris's power, her reach, and the two entities have basically been running from the Hiss this whole time. The Hiss invaded their plane of reality, Slidescape 36, and using Hedron's amplification, Polaris managed to escape to Earth by binding with Jesse. Later, Trench and Darling went into Slidescape 36 and brought Hedron back with them, which naturally pissed off the Hiss, because they wanted to use Hedron to further their reach. Think of the Hiss like a virus, and Hedron like a warm, moist cup. The Hiss were using Hedron to grow, to expand, and the FBC ripped that away from them. This is insane, it's bizarre, it's difficult to comprehend, it's genius. But how does Control present this information to us? Well, it doesn't. Instead, Hedron's reveal is framed by Jesse fighting waves and waves of Hiss that we've seen time and time again. After the ashtray maze, Hedron needs to make a memorable impact, but it doesn't. It's clumsy in its structure.
You are a worm through time. The thunder song distorts you. Happiness comes. White curls they go.
And the credits roll, seemingly ordinary, until we spot tiny inconsistencies in the text. The game director's name is Leave. Suddenly the words are melting, the Hiss resonance has broken through the game world, and it's all too clear that we've failed. And then, thud. Jesse's an intern, working for the FBC, surrounded by and sniping. The mundane returns with the menial tasks she needs to do. It's not as effective a fake-out as Alan Wake coming to under Dr. Hartman's care, but it's affecting. The player's left confused. It's seemingly random how long it takes for the mission to change. Completing one of the objectives sometimes triggers a new objective to bring mail to Director Trench. Sometimes it seems to just be on a timer. The whole section is compelling and maddening. We learn that Trench was the one who let the Hiss into the FBC, driven crazy by what he saw in Slidescape 36, forced to take his own life. Dead Jesse's hang suspended in the air, repeating the Hiss incantation over and over. Our mission, Find Darling's office, simulates the frustration that Jesse must feel in this moment because of course we can't find his bloody office. The whole game has been one big journey to each of his 50 billion offices littered all over the FBC. Of course, you're not going to remember where his first one is, especially when it looks no different to a standard boardroom or a bland cubicle. We have no powers, so we can't dash or levitate. We feel so disempowered. Everything between Jesse losing Polaris and Jesse being reunited with her is powerful, perfectly meshing gameplay, world design and motif. So it's beyond me why the game stumbles in its final minutes. Reaching for the slide projector, Jesse is transported to the astral plane, where the Hiss has channeled Dylan as a portal to corrupt the board. This image is end of days stuff. Two ethereal, impossible entities at war with each other. What the hell are we going to do? We're going to fight waves and waves of enemies we've already fought. Enemies which can suddenly take Jesse out in like one hit. Oh, but wait, Jesse can also take them out in one hit? That's an odd way to up the challenge. No final boss, not even against a possessed Dylan. Control has dropped us into an infected astral plane, and the best it can come up with is more guys with guns. Not even a final bizarre gotcha. It's such a dull way to finish Control's campaign. The Founder boss was more interesting than this last hurrah, and that was a side mission. There's not even any gameplay growth for Jessie, despite her finally embracing her role as director. For all the ashtray mazes and man-eating fridges and sticky note rooms and contorted monsters, Control chooses to make the last thing the player remembers an honest-to-God arena fight. And it's because of all the potential that Control has, all the greatness we've seen before now, that this ends up being one of the most disappointing finales of the 8th generation for me, and one of the most disappointing endings to a Remedy game ever.
The transmitter is just above. Reach it and take me offline before I destroy the entire
Nope, that's still worse. It also leaves the story too open in a lot of ways. I'm all for threads to pull on later. Hell, I think you can tell how much I love Alan Wake, suck, and that's been soaking in a cliffhanger for 10 years. There's a conversation to be had about how mysteries are set up in one story with the intention of answering it in the future. I was hardly expecting a full explanation to be given as to what the board is up to, but Darling's disappearance is established, fleshed out, and is one of the main narrative drives of Control. After he vanishes into some other plane, a concrete answer as to where he went isn't given to us. Hell, there's barely enough information to pull together a decent theory. So much time has been given to this mystery in particular that it leaves us feeling dissatisfied with its lack of conclusion. Jesse comes to the FBC with the intention of rescuing Dylan, and despite cleansing him of the Hiss and learning about his psychological torture at the hands of the FBC, the game ends with her siding with the people that did that to him, and Dylan himself is left comatose, locked in a cell. Again. His trauma hasn't been treated. She arrives at the Bureau to save him and ends up damning him, and the game doesn't seem to be aware of how ironic this is. Well, at least there's the DLC. SCP-XXXX is a portable mechanical typewriter. No manufacturer information, serial number, or other identifying features are present on SCP-XXXX. SCP-XXXX is sapient and is able to move its keys independently. However, it has expressed a reluctance to communicate unless loaded with paper and a ribbon of red ink. SCP-XXXX is also capable of understanding messages typed into it, allowing two-way communication. It is unknown how, as SCP-XXXX only appears to experience tactile sensations, but SCP-XXXX is able to distinguish between individuals it has communicated with. A majority of SCP-XXXX messages are typed in all capital letters in a verbose styling, and often include themes and imagery commonly featured in dark fantasy media. Such examples include: "Your time is nigh. If you have a god, start praying to it now," and "Please refrain from touching my keys while I am speaking. It is rude." Yeah, right. Supplemental. SCP-696 has started writing something new. Responses, it seems, criticisms, analysis to novels, film, even video games. Its descriptions of certain titles seems to be accurate, as if it has experienced this media itself, but I don't know how. Each essay, if we can call them that, as it lacks proper grammar or even structure, seems to be pulling thoughts from me. Critiques of media I, myself, have experienced in the past month are appearing at an average of 2 to 3 days without me ever mentioning them in its presence. See example SCP-696-4. The Chained Ogre is a crap early game enemy in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Is it reading me? I'm going to be asked to be removed from this project for the time being. The 2 pieces of DLC developed for Control are fantastic value for money, and with Control now being released as one package, it ought to be treated as a part of the game's core with modern critiques. And we should also note that Remedy tried to get away with charging you for a next-gen upgrade of the game, and when they were called out, they lied and tried to blame it on Sony and Xbox. Both Foundation and AWE offer new side quests, 2 new bosses, and most importantly, 2 new sectors for the player to explore, and they both feel distinct to the rest of the FPC, both visually and contextually. Remedy always planned to go deeper into the oldest house in one of their expansions. A building has to have a bottom, a base, a foundation, but what does the foundation of an infinite shifting maze look like? We got a glimpse of it in the main game, but rows of massive pillars are only the surface. Control's first DLC, Foundation, opts to dive deeper. Visually, the Foundation feels like a response to the oldest house's brutalist aesthetic. The dusty tunnels feel rougher in their textures, shaped by more natural means, more primal. Cave paintings adorn key areas. The red of the rock is a paler shade to separate the space from the malevolence of the hiss. There's a potential pitfall when transporting your character to such a contrasting space that it will feel like a genre bend, too fantasy-esque, especially with the use of crystals, but Remedy used Scottish river-cut caves, green serpentine and antigarite as reference points to ground it in realism. It feels like what it is, a labyrinthian expedition site, and without the clear diegetic signposting of the oldest house, it's easier to get lost in the Foundation's caves than it is to get lost in the Bureau's headquarters. Jesse's been dragged down here in a search for Marshall, who's inexplicably contacting us via the hotline. We're about to learn what it was that she deemed so important to exit the main story for. It appears that the astral plane is bleeding into our reality through the Foundation, depicted again by the creativity Remedy have when handling the incredible. That blinding white light is leaking into the murky caves in unnatural, shocking ways, bending the visual design to make it feel like we can slip into the astral plane at any moment. Later, Remedy finally give the player what we've been searching for in the main game, a noticeable shift in the level design influenced by the player's actions in the game world. A reliable space, which we've used to cut between different sections of the map, shatters completely, removing all security we may have developed during our lengthy investigation. Structurally, the Foundation follows a predictable structure. We repair 4 nodes connected to the Nail, a conduit between the oldest house and the astral plane before facing Marshall in a boss fight. Just like the main game, the Foundation is all about the journey, not the destination. Our quest to repair the 4 nodes teaches us how the oldest house is able to exist in our reality through the Nail anchoring it here. where the service weapon came from, uncovered by Director Northmour, the first director appointed by the board. Where Marshall went, she ran down here to blow up the nail before the Hiss entities could corrupt it. That the board has an explicit dark side and is terrified of losing its connection to Earth. It sends Jesse to assassinate Marshall before she can separate us. And finally we learn that the former isn't necessarily all bad. It's a disgraced former board member that was kicked out for reasons currently unknown to us. This is all great stuff for a DLC to tackle. It answers questions we didn't even know we had, and also leaves the door open for further exploration, and it also adds a new conflict to Jesse's journey. The board is furious with her for working with the former, and a new tension is established between the two, which I hope will be capitalized on in a future game.
So I'm just supposed to believe you're a particularly charitable, whatever you are?
The reason why the board is so mad with Jesse is because they let her take one new ability out of a choice of two, and she later gains the second power-up without their permission. Both Shape and Fracture were originally supposed to be in the main game, but by the time it came up in production, Remedy realised they would need to go back to the oldest house and rejig encounters to keep it useful. In the context of the Foundation, both powers are excellent. They're useful in combat and traversal, and encourage backtracking through the caves to uncover secrets hidden by the crystal. However, as a power set, it is just contextual, rendered useless when Jesse returns to the oldest house, which is a shame. It would have been nice if Shape or Fracture at least had combat capabilities after exiting the Foundation DLC to keep Jesse's growth consistent. As a result, when she returns to the oldest house after saving the day, she feels less powerful than she did in the Foundation DLC. Out of the Foundation's 3 side quests, 2 of them stand out as being my favourite in the entire game. Found footage requires you to escort an altered item, a television which can hypnotise enemies, into containment, putting a new twist both on combat, albeit temporarily, and a fresh twist on navigating the Foundation's caverns. Jesse Faden, starring in Swift Platform, might be one of my highlights of Control's entire experience. A film camera that makes people hallucinate that they're starring in a movie has Jesse on rails in a race down a tram track, blasting away at Hiss as they pursue her, and a pulsing synth soundtrack fills the moment with an awesome burst of energy. Just listen to this. The Foundation's new enemy, the Hiss Sharpened, is fine. Honestly, by this point, I'm not expecting Remedy to throw their best monster designs into their DLC, but Man with Hammer is hardly the fight I'm playing Control for. Remedy wanted to create a creature which was a core, melee combatant rather than ranged, and I wish there was some new twist to the Sharpened. They hit hard, and you need to stay away from them, something which is extremely easy with Levitate and Launch. We're in the earliest point in the oldest house's history. The astral plane is oozing into our reality, and we are still fighting angry men with tools. It really wasn't until the Foundation that I started to get irritated by this, because Remedy has proven themselves to be better than that in the past. I hope to hell that they set a rule for themselves in the next game. No humanoid enemies.
Marshall? You're alive.
Soon you will no longer recognize us, or yourself, or him, or her, or them. Family is dead. The walls are broken, but yellow and red in the eye.
This issue is translated to Marshall's boss fight as well. By the time we reach her, she's been corrupted by the Hiss, and aside from being able to throw grenades at us, she has very little new to offer. I was expecting Marshall to have been twisted and transformed by the board somehow, a last-ditch effort by them, harnessing the astral leaks to reshape her on a molecular level, but it seems like the astral leaks aren't all that harmful to us. They can tear about the reality of the oldest house, but the people inside are hunky-dory. Her arena, at least, is strong. Great chunky gaps and thin bridges to be aware of. Caves that we can trap Marshall in using Shape and Fracture. It's not a bad boss fight, it's just a sincerely underwhelming conclusion to the DLC. I'm beginning to think Remedy have a problem with endings.
Whatever you do, stay in the light.
I've been waiting for this. In the art and making of Control, Sam Lake said, For over 10 years we've had a crazy dream, the idea that the tales told in some of our games would be connected to each other, a connected world of stories and events with shared characters and lore. Slowly, patiently, behind the scenes, we've been planning and plotting to make this a reality. AWE turns Control's Easter eggs and references into full-blown lore, packaged up in a glossy Alan Wake cover. The inclusion of Alan Wake raises mind-boggling questions about the nature of Control's own story, as well as giving Jessie the opportunity to expand her knowledge of what entities exist beyond the Hiss. Just like the Foundation, AWE answers questions we didn't even know we had. What happens when two entities mix? Where does the Hiss incantation come from? How does Alan Wake factor into all of this? I've discussed our favourite shitty writer at length in my critique of his own game, but if you haven't noticed by now, I consider myself to be a bloody super fan of that game, so confirmation by Remedy that they haven't forgotten about Alan Wake, and better yet, that Control is going to give us an update on him, it was hard for me to contain my own excitement. So whilst my impressions of the AWE might be coloured by my affinity for the writer, I think this DLC is kinda awesome. It gives us a whole new floor of the oldest house that suddenly felt like it should have been there all along, the investigation sector. It embraces the horror of Alan Wake with Control's cold alien feel, making it feel incredibly tense. It has the best monster design in Remedy's history and the best boss fight.
Do I know you? I'm your friend Tom. Tom Zane. There's nothing to worry about.
Tom. The poet. The diver, you look different.
That was just a role. A character.
Right, my head hurts even thinking about this, but I think it strengthens my Mr. Scratch theory from my Alan Wake critique. It seems that Alan is speaking to himself while locked away in the darkness, but the subtitles tell us that this is Thomas Zane he's speaking to, taking on a form identical to Alan. He once again tells Alan not to worry about Mr. Scratch, his evil doppelganger, which is rampaging on the outside world, stalking Alice, causing carnage, murdering people. Tom claims he wasn't a poet, but a filmmaker, but we see evidence contrary to this in Control, with Jesse referencing Zane's poetry. I don't think this is necessarily Thomas Zane. I think it's the Dark Presence, taking on a new form to manipulate Alan into writing a new escape for it. It's been 10 years. Alan is slowly beginning to forget who he is, why he's even there. He's barely holding it together. So, Alan writes. He writes the Hiss into existence, developing its incantation to push Jesse into taking on the role of the hero which he needs. I don't think he writes the entirety of Control or creates the FBC, but we do see evidence that his escape attempts have resulted in various AWEs which the FBC need to investigate, and one of his attempts is this DLC itself.
Vibrating, remolding. The sound changes the darkness, and the darkness changes the sound. They both changed what remained of Hartman. They all turned into something else. A third thing.
He writes Hartman's evolution in the form of the Night Springs scripts we can find. The Dark Presence and the Hiss warp him into a hideous creature which roams the investigation sector, trying to break free. And if it does, it will give the Dark Presence the opportunity to spread its influence to the outside world once again. Jessie finds herself trapped in an Alan Wake story. Mechanically, Jesse doesn't get any new powers, but the player needs to think creatively with light, finding lamps to burn away the globular black mass to gain access to new areas. AWE is framed as one big hunt through the investigation sector, searching for Dr. Emil Hartman. It combines Alan Wake's excellent light mechanic with Control's invigorating power set to create a really natural combination for the two games, despite them being so tonally different. It also gives fans of Alan Wake a little treat in the return of Hartman. You may remember that one of my criticisms of that game was how the Doctor was built up to be such an effective villain just to be wiped away in one cutscene, removing any catharsis from the player. Control gives us that in spades. Hartman's research into the Dark Presence has evolved him into something grotesque. His bodily proportions are all out of sync. Seeing him haze in and out of the darkness is terrifying, not just because he's so hideous, but because he packs one hell of a punch. And it's for all these reasons and more that Hartman becomes Control's coolest boss. Defeating him isn't just about launching benches and cabinets his way, it's about navigating the darkness. If Jessie gets caught in shadow, she loses her connection with Polaris. Her force meter is drained, rendering her essentially useless. It's the game's greatest challenge, risking the gloom to find a power box so we can turn the lights on and burn him away. It's the sort of logical, out-of-the-box thinking I hoped to see more of in the main game's enemy encounters. When all of this comes to a head in the Bright Falls AWE, Hartman is as ghastly in the light as he is in the dark. He's a two-stage fight, able to launch projectiles so Jessie needs to keep moving, able to teleport and grab her so the player never feels safe, even with the tried and tested strategy of levitating. His defeat feels earned, making AWE a suitable continuation of the Alan Wake story while bridging it with Jessie's adventure.
Ma'am, I'm getting something on my terminal here, an AWE alert from Bright Falls, Washington. But it might be a glitch. The date's all wrong, a couple of years in the future.
Is that an Alan Wake 2 release date? With Alan writing more escape attempts, it's inevitable that he would bring it back to Cauldron Lake. Langston says that the system is picking up an AWE event a couple of years in the future, potentially 2022, and best of all, we're returning to our roots here, namely Twin Peaks.
It's happening again. A return. You have been warned.
Yeah, you didn't think I'd forget about that old chestnut, did you? Twin Peaks' third season, which returned after a 2-decade hiatus to give fans the conclusion of Dale Cooper's story, was marketed not as Twin Peaks 3, but as Twin Peaks: The Return. The phrase, "it's happening again," was plastered all over the promos and posters, and you've got to love Remedy for doubling down on their influences in its teasing of the next chapter of Wake's story. The FBC itself has similarities to the Blue Rose from Twin Peaks, a faction of the FBI tasked with investigating the supernatural. Mr. C, Dale Cooper's evil doppelganger, has a similarity to Alan Wake's Mr. Scratch. Both are out, causing murderous havoc, while our hero is lost in another plane of reality, slowly losing their mind. How much of Twin Peaks: The Return will rear its head in Alan Wake 2, or Control 2, or whatever Remedy decide to call our sequel remains to be seen, but it's interesting nevertheless.
The portal's been closed, but the hiss is still in the oldest house. And the lockdown can't be lifted as long as any trace of it remains. I'm working on a solution with my management team, but there is still a long road ahead. I'm the director of the Federal Bureau of Control.
Control is greater than the sum of its parts, but the weight of those parts is what defines it. Its weirdness is invaded by dull enemy variety, a Goot system which is dissatisfying and overcomplicated, and a story which serves as background noise. But I can't help but love it. Because yes, while Control mechanically doesn't go beyond the weird, I think what makes it so engaging has a lot more weight than the irritation we feel when a bureau alert pops up on our screens to funnel us into busy work. No game is perfect, but even fewer try to be different, and Control does try. It tries its damnedest, even when it makes the game worse. It washes itself in some of the most fascinating lore that I've seen in a long time. It pulls and reworks its inspirations in a way which Alan Wake even struggled to do. Its atmosphere is as thick and concrete as the walls of the oldest house, and speaking of the FBC, its headquarters carry some of the most impressive visual and level design I've ever seen in a game. All of that has real, pure weight that only comes with a piece of art that breathes like this one. Mechanically, Control doesn't go beyond its strangeness, but those mechanics don't define Control as an experience. For every kill hiss guy objective is an ashtray maze. For every is an enthralling backstory for Jesse which can and needs to be built on later. The joy of Control is wrapping your brain around it. Nothing is fed to the player, everything requires you to think to get the most out of it, and when thinking is one of the game's most engaging takeaways, I can't fault that it was worth my time and money. There's a lot for Remedy to learn and grow from, but I'm excited to learn with them. Control may not go beyond the weird, but it tries its best to embrace it. And sometimes, that's enough. SCP-643 is a collection of 79 chocolate candies. Individual instances of SCP-643 do not appear to have notable aesthetic differences from normal chocolates, and on average weigh between 100 and 160 grams. Any substance that is covered with SCP-643 will begin to exude a strong, pleasant aroma. Organisms that consume SCP-643 become instances of SCP-643-1. Instances of SCP-643-1 will possess the same desirability as any edible substance coated in SCP-643. Any organism that views an instance of SCP-643-1 will attempt to consume it, regardless of any previous relation. Shh, don't speak, I'm just finishing up. Organisms who consume portions of SCP-643-1 will describe the experience as highly pleasurable. At this time, it is uncertain whether or not eating an SCP-643-1 subject would result in the eater becoming delicious themselves. I think further testing is necessary. Thanks for watching, and how's everyone doing? I'm doing good. We just moved a few days ago as of this video going live, so things are going to be a bit manic moving to August, but I should still have a video releasing before we hit September, so have no fear. If you liked what you saw, consider dropping a like or even a comment. I'm especially curious to know if Control was your first Remedy game, or if you played Max Payne, Alan Wake, hell, even Quantum Break before it released. A big thank you to my £2 patrons who help keep the lights on and are getting us closer and closer to a new rig so I can improve on the quality of these videos. So major shout out to Derek8, The Rift Maker, CC, Jared Hafer, Lucas Coimbra, Smirky Coast, Scott Russell, Graham McLaughlin, Semlin, Evan Loftus, Beth Littler, Caroni Macaroni, John Foster Agg, Robert Capel, Elevator, Hector Arredondo, Matt McCulloch, Guillermo Barreros Ferreira, Ethan, Paul W, Lord K, Damp Gibbon, Please Don't Blame, Chief Sweep, Ahor May, Jonathan Lum, Jaker, Robolo42, Paper Synth, Thomas Banchak, Eddie Wingforce, Reese Newton Seeley, Nicholas Here, Cakesters, Strupp, Angry Optimist, Plog Doctor, Adriana Martinez, Shiftery, Jana Grasfrau, Chris, Jake Klozovitz, Croatoan, Long Cheddar, Jordan Halsey, Amory Selden, DB Geek, Ryan Smith, Rasmus Nemvaltz, Toxter, Donis Conva, 100 Sams, Neil Dudgeon, Michael Diaz, Bob the Mighty 5454, Dinkin Pearson, Kyle Pearce, Christopher McKinnon, Seb Scott, Lonely Ronan, Crisp Bread, Zephyr Dawn, Kane Highwind, Neve Care, and Johnny Miller. You guys are awesome, thank you so much. Take care.